In this video, I'm going to try to beat every 3D Zelda game in 7 days. Yes, spanning from Ocarina of Time all the way up to the newest Zelda game, Tears of the Kingdom. But there's a twist. Speedrunners have completely destroyed these games, beating them before Link even has a chance to let his Deku Nuts drop. Quite literally. So in an attempt to beat these games as they were intended, and to put myself through even more pain, I am going to beat all these games without performing a single glitch. I'll be beating each game the intended way, dungeon by dungeon, in a week's worth of time. The average time spent by players of these games, even in a rushed playthrough, is super long, so this will be a heck of a challenge, and you wouldn't believe how insane things get by the time I get to the last 2 games. So without further ado, grab a snack, strap in, and join me on this absolute beast of a challenge as I try to beat every 3D Zelda game in 7 days. Kicking things off with a cult classic, we have Ocarina of Time. Just for your viewing pleasure, for the entire video, I put the current day, as well as the time, that the footage you see on screen was filmed, so that you get a better idea of my progress as I'm working through each of these games. Out of all 7 games that I'll be playing through, Ocarina of Time is probably the one I haven't played in the longest amount of time, where I haven't touched this game since I beat it on my 3DS all the way back in 2013. Even though I haven't played this game in so long, I played this game to death back in the day, and going into this challenge, I felt like this game wouldn't give me a crazy amount of trouble, or so I thought. Also, I forgot to mention this, but I'll be attempting to complete this challenge without looking up solutions to any of the puzzles in these games, so if I end up getting completely lost in the water temple, and spend like 6 hours in that dungeon alone, that's that, and I'll just have to pick up the pace and power through the challenge. Also, you'll notice that I'm playing the N64 version of this game. Playing this version wasn't a secret tactic or anything. That was just me being stupid and not planning ahead. The pacing in the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time is significantly quicker, where you're able to mash through scrolling text a lot faster, and there's a bunch of random quality of life improvements on the 3DS version that make it quicker and easier to play. That would have made this challenge a bit easier for me, which would have been nice. So as I began my playthrough of Ocarina of Time, I immediately found a sword within a patch of sentient rolling boulders, found a Kokiri's secret drug money, and bought a shield. Also, come on Nintendo. They named the shop Coke Erie Shop. They knew exactly what they were doing with this one. So after sitting through a few long cutscenes, I entered the Great Deku Tree. This dungeon was pretty chill and easy, along with the other 2 child dungeons of Dodongo Cavern and Jabu Jabu's Belly, partly because I finished each of them like 20 times as a kid, because for whatever reason, whenever I would get stuck in one of the harder adult dungeons, I would restart the entire game over again to give myself a false sense of making some sort of progress or something. I know, it doesn't even make sense to me looking back at it. These first 3 dungeons also seem super basic and elementary now, because I'm so used to the 3D Zelda formula of hitting a switch, finding a key, killing the boss, that it just seems second nature to me at this point. That didn't stop me from dying a shameful amount of times while playing this game though. This was largely due to me being careless, but Link's movement in the N64 Zelda entries seems a bit restrictive and stiff, and his movement in the later entries of the series feel a lot more fluid, making you feel as though you have a lot more control over Link's movements. So after forgetting how to fight Goma, I tossed some cuckoos into the resting place in exchange for a bottle to store fairies in, to compensate for my inevitable suckery, and honestly, safety strats like these are pretty necessary in a marathon run like this. Next, I made a giant lizard meatball in Dodongo Cavern, narrowly avoided getting manhandled by some pop cereal, watched Humpty Dumpty scratch his anus for 30 seconds, and backpedaled to the Temple of Time to attain the Master Sword. Also yes, walking backwards like this is actually a little bit faster than walking forward the normal way. That's kind of a shame though, because we all love Link's obsessive shrieks every single time he does a roll, right? Speaking of annoying noises, let's talk about Navi. A lot of people say she's super annoying with her "hey listens," but I actually didn't really find her all that annoying during my speedrun of this game. Granted, she did bring Link's progress to a sudden halt on a few occasions, but that wasn't very often, and I kind of just spammed the button to mash through her dialogue as quickly as possible anyway. Also, she does yell "hey listen" to you a lot.
Hey, listen!
But I don't know if I just tuned her out subconsciously at this point, but I didn't really notice her all that much. But anyway, from here, I raised Sloth from the Goonies in a cave in exchange for some treasure, and made my way into the first adult dungeon, the Forest Temple. At this point in the challenge, I was getting close to playing for about 3.5 hours, and was feeling pretty good about my progress. As I started working through the grind of beating all 7 adult dungeons, I really started to notice how such a substantial part of this game takes place in the dungeons alone. Granted, I was on a mission and didn't have time to play dress up with Poindexter and hunt for spiders, but I couldn't help but notice how you can pretty easily just hop from dungeon to dungeon and not worry about the townsfolk and their woes and worries, unlike a lot of the later 3D Zelda games. That's not to say this game doesn't come with its own set of frustrations though, where in the Forest Temple, I came face to face with the bane of my existence, Stalfos, aka the Time Wasters. I'm not sure there's some secret strat to take these guys out that I don't know about, but it seems like the only way to kill them is to sit there and wait with your shield out, and attack them when they let their guard down. And even sitting there with their shield out doesn't really even work right, because each time one attacks you, there's a random chance that it'll totally clip through your shield and do a whole 2 hearts of damage. And my health was extremely valuable in this playthrough, because for each game that I'm playing through, I'm not spending time collecting heart pieces and armor upgrades. The only heart container upgrades I'm getting is from beating bosses. But anyway, overall, the Forest Temple wasn't super crazy difficult, and from here, I backpedaled my way over to Goron City. Also, fun fact, you don't actually have to get Epona in order to beat the game, even though she seems like such a staple of Ocarina of Time. I opted to not waste time unlocking her, but I'm kinda curious to see if getting Epona would have saved time, because even though I was walking from place to place in the quickest way possible, I ended up having to trek across Hyrule Fields one too many times than I would have liked, and Epona moves significantly faster than Link could ever dream of. So once in Goron City, I faced an evil, possibly more great than the Stalfos, myself, Offbeat the Goron, who you have to stop with a bomb in order to get the red tunic to access the Fire Temple. This guy has to be the master of jukes because every time I would throw a bomb at the guy, he would be 10 steps ahead of me and know exactly where to go to avoid it. Also, it doesn't help that the bomb has a questionable hitbox at times. There's actually 2 ways to get this red tunic. The more frustrating way is to bomb this Goron, but you could actually just straight up buy one from the Goron merchant for 200 rupees. Being that I didn't meddle in the quest to exterminate the gold Skulltula population, I wasn't able to obtain the big boy wallet and had to resort to the more difficult option. After spending an embarrassing amount of time sniping the talking rock, I made my way into the Fire Temple. I felt a little bad trying to blow up the little guy, so to make things right, I saved some other talking rocks from their prisons and killed a dragon whack-a-mole style. All in all, this dungeon wasn't too bad, but up next, I had to face the hardest dungeon in the game by a long shot, no pun intended, the Water Temple. In all its water level changing glory. Out of all the areas in the 3D Zelda games that I had to face this week, this Water Temple was actually one of the ones that I was the most nervous about. Remember how I said as a kid, I would restart my playthrough of the game and play the child dungeons over and over again because I got stuck in the adult dungeons? Yeah, that was almost solely due to the Water Temple. I think I only beat it twice on my 3DS back in the day. Once on normal mode, and once on Master Quest mode, and I barely remember how to progress through it going into this challenge. And at the beginning of the challenge, I vowed to not look up any solutions to any of the puzzles for any of these 3D Zelda games. So yeah, long story short, I spent a whopping 2 hours in this dungeon alone, which really messed up my pace. I don't dislike the Water Temple by any means. Quite honestly, I think its design is genius. It's just that if you go into it without focusing on what's where and which rooms you need to backtrack to, you're essentially doomed. What really got me stuck for a while is in order to find a certain key, you have to raise the water to the middle floor, sink to the bottom floor with your iron boots, go to a specific room, float to the top, and bomb a cracked wall that you have to remember seeing earlier on in the dungeon. Talk about high-level thinking. Also, speaking about iron boots, yes, I had to open up the pause menu every single time I wanted to swap out my boots. Was it annoying? Honestly, not as bad as many people make it out to be. It only takes like 4 seconds to swap them out if you do it fast. It does get slightly frustrating though, when you get lost in the dungeon like I did, and have to put them on and take them off like 100 times. Also, I actually straight up died during this Dark Link fight, which was extremely unpleasant because once I died, I had to exit the dungeon, swim all the way across Lake Hylia to grind for full health, and travel all the way back to the mini-boss chamber, which happened to be pretty far from the dungeon's entrance. I died the first time because I wasted so much of my health trying to find Dark Link's weakness, that I didn't really end up even finding, if there even is a Nintendo weakness. During my second attempt, I kinda just swung my sword around like a madman, which actually worked quite decently well surprisingly. If you Z-target him, it's extremely hard to hit him with your sword, because he mimics your every move, but if you flail around aimlessly in his general direction without Z-targeting him, Dark Link gets confused and doesn't know how to respond to counter your attacks. So once I beat Dark Link, and took out the boss Morpha, I left the dungeon and didn't look back. Once finally beating the Water Temple, I was about 7.5 to 8 hours into the challenge, which I honestly didn't feel good about, and I knew I really needed to pick up the pace if I had any hope to beat this challenge in time. So from here, I entered Kakariko Village to watch Sheik breakdance for a bit, jumped down a well to steal a magnifying lens from an old hag, and made my way into the Shadow Temple, which was pretty easy puzzle-wise, but was definitely the hardest dungeon in the game for me combat-wise. It was full of spikes, scythes, and those skeleton guys that I've learned to despise, Also, there was a super annoying section, which I think was just the devs trolling, where next to the boat that you have to ride across the hall, if you move a block and climb up a wall, and go through a door, you find yourself towards the beginning of the dungeon, but when you try to come back the same way you came, apparently King Rahone Bosphorus Hyrule descended from the heavens himself and pushed the block back in place, because there's no way you're getting back the same way you came. So you have to take some roundabout way to get to the boat area again. So after getting back on track, I got absolutely destroyed by the thing from the Addams family, which left me at 3 hearts going into the boss chamber. And this is where things got really tense, where I had to fight arguably the scariest entity in Zelda, Bongo Bongo, an invisible shadow beast that lurks in the depths, who makes guttural rhythmic chants. I had to kill this boss without dying to stay on track, where dying here could set me back by 20 to 30 minutes, trying to grind for health and trudging through the dungeon again. I died just like that. But what's this? A spare fairy! With a resurgence of determination, I continued to push on, but soon found myself with dangerously low health. And with that, I put the beast to rest with 2 hearts left, and watched as he played his last drum hit. Honestly, I probably shouldn't have lost so much health to this guy, but I totally forgot how to damage him going into the fight, and I didn't even realize that you could hurt his hands with your bow or hookshot, so I spent the whole fight getting dangerously close to his hands to attack them. Also, when he charges at you with his eye, and if you miss, he takes a whopping 3 hearts away, which is absolutely absurd. From here, I made my way to Gerudo Valley, and healed myself and stocked up on some fairies in the desert, because there's no way I wanted to game over again like I did in the Water Temple. A lot of Ocarina of Time's movement in dungeons consists of slow block pushing puzzles, and waiting for the right time to move forward, which makes retracing your steps a time-consuming process, especially when you die during a boss fight. So after turning into a child and lying to my elders, I started to make a decent amount of progress through the Spirit Temple. Nothing too special happened here, except I found it pretty hilarious that these flying pots kept smashing into me that would do a quarter heart of damage, but more often than not, they'd have a heart inside of them, so I would actually get a net gain in health. Like, talk about reverse trolling. So after taking out the frog-eyed witch twins, I made my way over to the last stand of this game, Ganon's Tower. The different rooms that you had to play through to unlock the center area went really well, and there was this Darknut fight leading up to Ganondorf that I made sure to play super carefully, because if you get hit, you lose a whopping 4 hearts. I didn't want to waste my precious time getting any defense upgrades or heart pieces, so I was really banking on not dying during this final boss fight. Upon entering Ganondorf's lair, I played a game of tennis, which probably shows up more time in Zelda games than it really should. Like, I can't be the only one who thinks this is ridiculous, right? Like, imagine scaling up the winding staircases of Ganon's tower, hearing the menacing organ playing of Ganondorf become louder and louder as you get closer, all to have the climax just be you and him smacking back and forth a ball of light, as if you're playing catch with your old man in the backyard or something. Anyway, I knocked out Ganondorf without much trouble, but the real headache came to fruition with a mad dash out of the tower before it collapsed. I don't know if I was just bad at this game, but there's really not much room for error here, and I don't like to admit it, but I actually died during this sequence a few times. Luckily, when you die, you respawn at the beginning of the timer and not before the Ganondorf fight though. The main source of my troubles here stemmed from these guys, the Stalfos. In order to progress through a certain room, you have to kill 2 of them at roughly the same time, where if you kill one too early, it will eventually respawn. The problem here is that they take forever to let their guards down, so that you can attack. There's so much RNG here, and I don't know if I was doing something wrong, but these guys took ages to swing at me so that I could counterattack. After these guys, there were a bunch of random falling meteors that could easily snipe you, and in a last-ditch effort to ruin your day, the devs even put a redead close to the exit to waste precious seconds. The final fight against Beast Ganon went really well without many faults, and I was able to beat the game with a total playtime of about 12.5 hours. That time does include breaks for food and what have you, so by this point, it was close to the end of the first day. I decided to throw in the towel at this point for the day, because I was feeling pretty good about my progress, and with 7 games needing to be beaten in 7 days, this seemed like a good place to leave off. Or so I hoped. Kicking it off with the next morning, I started my playthrough of Majora's Mask, and I sort of felt at home playing a game about a 3-day cycle in the 7-day challenge. Similar to Ocarina of Time, I'll be playing the N64 version, to my detriment, because I didn't realize how quicker the 3DS version plays until I was editing this video. The N64 version has quite a bit of cutscenes, all of them unskippable, and dialogue boxes move super slow most of the time. I guess that time waiting around gave me time to rest my eyes and do other things, but I was honestly trying to get this challenge completed as soon as possible, so that I wouldn't have to stay up extremely late on the last day. Majora's Mask is actually a 3D Zelda game that I was the most familiar with before starting this challenge, because my last playthrough of it was only like a year ago at this point. So I went through the normal Deku Link gameplay pretty quickly, of unlocking the town title deed, and waiting in front of the clock tower. I did not have the ocarina at this point in the game, so I couldn't play the Song of Double Time to skip ahead in time to the night of the third day, so I just sat there and waited for a little over 20 minutes for the door to open, so that I could progress. Apparently to skip time ahead quicker, I could have talked to the Scarecrow in the Astral Observatory, which is similar to playing the Song of Double Time, but for whatever reason, that Scarecrow totally slipped my mind as being a thing in the game. Luckily, I used a bit of this time waiting to eat breakfast, so it wasn't an entire waste of time. I tried going to Grandma to read me a bedtime story, but apparently she has a closed door policy for Deku scrubs such as myself. Upon entering the top of the tower, I beat the Skull Kid senseless with my bubble-blowing baby capabilities, and played some smooth jazz to warp back in time to be human again. There's only 4 main dungeons in this game that I'll have to tackle, which may seem like a pretty quick process on surface level, but there's a bunch of extra stuff that we'll have to do in between dungeons that honestly, probably took up a little bit more than half of my playthrough of this game. The first dungeon to tackle was in the swamp, so I went to the Deku Palace and infiltrated their defenses, which was strikingly similar to having to juke the guards in Ocarina of Time. There's all kinds of tiny similarities that I noticed playing these games back to back that I'll touch on as they come up, but saving these monkeys in Majora's Mask actually comes up in Twilight Princess, except in Twilight Princess, you can swing on them like Tarzan. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Once I got through the Deku Palace maze, I bought some magic beans from this Dobby hippo-looking creature, and played the Sonata of Awakening to enter Woodfall Temple. This dungeon was very easy and isn't really worth talking about, but the boss at the end was slightly annoying because at first, he sends out a swarm of these moth-looking creatures that you have to hide in the Deku Leaf thing until they go away, and the guy takes quite a bit of hits to take down. You can pretty easily stun him by spinning in Deku Link form, and then attacking him with your sword though. Also, I noticed that the combat in Majora's Mask is generally quite a bit easier than Ocarina of Time, because the game gives you a lot of hearts to pick up in pots and boss chambers, and what have you, where in Ocarina of Time, hearts were a bit harder to come across on the regular. After beating the boss, I went ahead and brought the Deku Princess back to her father to save the monkey from being roasted alive, because quite honestly, I just felt bad for the poor guy, and played the Song of Time to revert back to the dawn of the first day. From here, I made my way to the Snowhead area when my progress came to a sudden halt when I realized that you need the bombs to blow up some snoulders. So I returned to Clocktown to confront the only bomb-wielding hooligan I knew, the little old lady, who you have to save from Sakon the Thief on the night of the first day in exchange for the blast mask. I used it to kamikaze through some snow, put up with some incessant wailing, stopped said wailing with the grooving melody of my drums, made a giant Goron plummet to his death in the icy crevasse below, and entered the second dungeon with being 3 hours into the second day of the challenge. Snowhead Temple was actually a bit more challenging than I remembered, and sort of gave me Ocarina of Time Water Temple vibes, with having to travel to different floors to change the height of a central pillar. It wasn't as hard as the Water Temple, but it was a bit annoying at times trying to figure out what floor I needed to be on at each given time, and I was nervous about how in certain areas, it was super easy to accidentally fall all the way down to the bottom of the dungeon, which would have lost a lot of time. The 4 dungeons in this game also introduced a major annoyance for me that was intended by the developers to be something to help the player: the Stray Fairies. You may be thinking, why Offbeat? How could such innocent and defenseless creatures be such a detriment to your run? Well, that's because I couldn't tell you how many times I would open a chest or progress through a certain dungeon just to find myself a useless stray fairy as a quote-unquote reward. These things are only beneficial to the player if they find all 15 of them in a given dungeon, and being that I'll be trying to beat these dungeons as quickly as possible, these stray fairies just gumped up my run because they serve no benefit to me. I don't have these dungeons memorized by any means, so my plan for each dungeon was to explore as much of them as quickly as possible in order to make sure that I find all the necessary hidden keys. But more often than not, when I would go to open a chest thinking it would be a key or something useful, it would end up being one of these stray fairies. Like, I actually got a bit lost in Snowhead for a little bit, trying to look for a small key, just to find it in a chest that I was almost certain had a stray fairy in it, due to how out in the open the chest was. Anyway, moving on from that tangent, I took out the boss, which takes the crown for my favorite boss in any Zelda game, Goat. Got? I don't know. This thing kinda looks like a goat though. and in order to kill it, you have to repeatedly ram into it as Goron Link until it falls down so that you can make it vulnerable. Once he was defeated, the snow melted, and I used a powdered keg to blast open the Goron racing area because I really wanted to win the first place prize of an empty bottle. This is because later on in the game, in the Great Bay area, you have to transport a bunch of these Zora eggs from the Pirate's Fortress area to the Marine Research Lab, and I felt like doing this with 2 bottles would be a lot quicker in the long run than transporting each egg one by one with 1 bottle. The Goron racing area quickly made me realize how little Link was a Goron at heart, because I lost again, and again, and again. And it was super annoying how much time I was losing. It was super easy to accidentally bump against a wall or a Goron and lose all of my momentum, which would almost always result in me losing the entire race. Also, I got straight up knocked off the course one time and got disqualified, which was alarming, to say the least. And at times, I was so close yet so far, until eventually, I caught a break. I barely scraped by and got the win on my 5th attempt. The rubber banding during this race was insane though, where it felt like anytime I got the lead, I would get passed by a roided up Goron barreling ahead of me. From here, I played the Song of Time to warp to the first day, and used a powdered keg to blast open the pathway towards the ranch in order to unlock Epina. Epina is in fact required in this glitchless run, because you need her in order to jump the fence into the Great Bay area. I was debating on if I wanted to save the ranch from the aliens in exchange for another bottle, but that whole process of keeping the ranch safe all night long is such a time-consuming process, and I decided that 2 bottles to transport the Zora eggs seemed like enough, even though I'd be backtracking to the Pirate's Fortress a little bit. Once in Great Bay, I witnessed the ghost of a fishman jam out as Link looked with a blank stare, unimpressed, got yeeted from a 3-story building on a hard metal platform a few times after getting caught trespassing, went fishing in some fish tanks, and returned the fishies to learn the new wave bossa nova song, which I used to hitchhike on a turtle to take me to the 3rd main dungeon, Great Bay Temple. I actually thought this dungeon was super fun, and actually a little bit easier than Snowhead Temple. The central mechanic of the dungeon revolved around changing the rotation of the water in the central rooms in order to access specific areas, but I didn't really find it all that frustrating, and you only need to change the rotation of the water 1 time in order to beat the dungeon. It's hard to ignore how much the central room resembles a toilet bowl flushing though. So I could see how people coined this dungeon the Toilet Bowl Dungeon of Zelda. The only part that I found pretty annoying for this area was the boss Gaiorg. It's a bit annoying to deal damage to this thing, because you actually have to jump in the water to do so, and when you get too close to it in the water when it's attacking, it straight up eats you and does a whole 2 hearts of damage, which is strikingly similar to that annoying fish thing from Super Mario Bros. 3. Luckily, I had a fairy and didn't die, and was able to knock him out, where my total playtime at this point for the day was about 7.5 hours. At this point in the challenge, I wasn't tired at all because I'm pretty used to staring at computer screens all day, but I was starting to feel what I like to call Zelda fatigue, which was a little concerning this early on. All of the 3D Zelda games have a very similar formula, minus Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, so it started to feel like my time playing these games was blending together, and I was just doing the same kind of thing all day. But despite that, I decided to buckle up and keep pushing on. Next up, I made my way to the 4th and final region of the game, Ikana Canyon, which also happens to be the longest stretch of the game in between dungeons, where this area consists of racing the Mario Brothers, getting manhandled by mummies as part of this super long fetch quest, and performing an exorcism on a demonic creature that a little girl has locked up in her basement. The fetch quest with the mummies was probably the most annoying part of this game though, where you had to do dumb stuff like backtrack to the swamp and buy 5 magic beans from Hungry Hippo here, and backtrack to Snowhead to retrieve some warm spring water. Luckily, most of the stuff that you need to give the mummies can be found within their cave, but it was a little annoying having to revisit previous areas that I already traversed. There is also a mini dungeon within Ikana Canyon that you have to complete that is decently easy and not that long, but once you get to the top, you find a cracked ceiling. You would think that you would need to do the logical thing and bomb the ceiling with one of your bombs, right? Well, apparently that isn't good enough because you have to backtrack all the way to Snowhead again, purchase a powdered keg, climb all the way to the top of the mini dungeon again, and use the powdered keg to let the sunlight in. Talk about a long and annoying process. There is actually a boss of this mini dungeon, which I'm embarrassed to admit, gave me more hassle than it probably should have. The first phase of the fight consists of you needing to take out 2 skeleton guys until they're a pile of bones, and then reflect sunlight with your mirror shield at them until they die. The real tough part for me was phase 2, where you have to defeat the main skeleton guy. He doesn't go down nearly as easily, and one of his most frustrating moves was when he detaches his head from his body and flies around to chomp on you. This attack was almost impossible to dodge, and I was only ever able to roll away at just the right time to not take damage by this thing. Also, it didn't help that I didn't do any of the side quests, so I only had 6 hearts for the duration of this fight, and the scaly guys can do a crap ton of damage. I found out that the only way to kill this guy is to stay super close to him, so that he only attacks with his sword, and once he swings at you when you have your shield up, immediately swing back with your sword. But it also doesn't help that he does this annoying attack with his hot breath that can deal damage. I mean, seriously, this guy's breath must be putrid. But eventually I got the best of him, and scorched his remains with my shield. From here, I made some Ben Drowns, scaled up Stone Tower, and entered the last main dungeon, Stone Tower Temple. This dungeon went decently well, but I will admit that I spent a bit longer on it than I would have liked, where it took me a whole 2 hours to get through. The dungeon itself is really long with 2 mini-bosses, and it was a bit challenging puzzle-wise, trying to wrap my head around turning the whole dungeon upside down halfway through, which was super trippy. There were sections that I had to play Elegy of Emptiness to get those statues of Link to appear to press switches, and the whole process of whipping up the ocarina, playing the song, and waiting for the little animation to play was super time consuming, and it was a slog whenever I had to play that song. A big challenge came during the final boss fight against Twin Mold. I could tell by this point in the game, the developers thought that the player would have found a lot more stat boosts and side quest items because not long into the fight, I totally ran out of magic. In order to attack the giant flying snakes, you have to wear your giant's mask and smack them around, but the giant's mask takes magic to use, so during the whole fight you're on a time limit. If you break the massive pillars, there's a chance that they drop magic, but I neglected using them to my advantage and unknowingly let them go to waste. Once I ran out of magic, I tried sniping the tails with my bow, but once I was out of arrows, I knew I was out of luck and had to accept death, which was super annoying because I invested so much time into this first attempt. Once back in the boss arena again, I was a lot more careful with conserving the magic in the pillars until I actually needed them, and was actually able to take out the boss with quite a bit of magic left to spare. So with the 4 main dungeons complete, I made my way back to Clocktown, and accidentally ran into a Bomberman member who gave me the Bomberman notebook. It's honestly pretty hilarious how I ran into this guy now, so late into the game, because that's usually something you get super early on. So with that, I made my way towards the final stand of the game, the fight against Majora. This guy was no joke, and was quite a bit harder than the final boss from Ocarina of Time. Usually when I fight this guy, it's at the end of a 100% run, where I have the Fierce Deity Mask, and totally destroy him with ease. So it was an interesting experience to be fighting him with a starting sword, barely any masks, and with 7 hearts. There's 3 total phases, where the first one consists of the mask flying around, the second consists of it growing legs and moonwalking around the room, and the third phase is the hardest of them all, where it grows these whipped tentacle things that can grab you and toss you across the arena, doing a massive dent in your health. At this last phase, I had decently high health, but I was out of healing items, and dying here would set me back like 30 or 40 minutes because if I died, I would have to play the Song of Time to stock up on fairies, get the town title deed, and wait until the final hours of the 3rd day all over again to get another shot at the boss. So long story short, the final phase of this boss fight was super tense, and it already felt like I spent way too long playing this game. I clutched the final fight with 1 heart left as I beat the second game of this absolute gauntlet of a challenge. I spent a little over 12.5 hours playing Majora's Mask, which is slightly longer compared to how long it took me to beat Ocarina of Time. Going into this challenge, I thought for sure that I would have enough time to beat Majora's Mask in less than a day to allow me to start the next game, but that was clearly not the case. I thought that since the game only had 4 main dungeons, it wouldn't be as long, but towards the end of the second day of this challenge, I had my doubts that I would have enough time to beat the absolute beasts of games coming up. But either way, I was feeling pretty drained after that intense boss fight, and decided to pick things up with the next game in the morning. The next morning, I started my playthrough of the next 3D Zelda game to be released, The Wind Waker. With this one, I started to wise up choosing the quickest version of the game to complete, where I chose to play through the Wii U version of Wind Waker, instead of the GameCube version. In standard Zelda remake fashion, the Wii U version offers quite a bit of quality of life improvements, but the main perk of this version can be boiled down to 2 words: Swift Sail. Yes, apparently Nintendo themselves were regretful of how slow the sailing took in the original Wind Waker, that they allowed the player to purchase a quicker sail at the in-game auction, which increases Link's sailing speed by twice as fast, and even changes the direction of the wind automatically, negating Link's needing to play the Wind's Requiem to change wind direction. You can also skip the beginning cutscene now, which I took full advantage of. The beginning of the game went exactly how you would expect. I learned sword techniques from this guy with cataracts in both eyes, which is concerning the more you think about it. Showed some Bokoblins who's boss, and got launched into a side of a rock so hard that I became so concussed that I started hearing voices come out of a talking rock. All in all though, the Forsaken Fortress went pretty well, but I admittedly got lost for a bit and was tossed in the slammer a few times, which was unpleasant. Eventually I made it to where Link's sister was being held, where a giant bird tossed me into the horizon, like something straight out of Pokemon with Team Rocket. After some sailing around, I met up with some bird people, tossed one of them into a wall so that they would feel what I felt earlier, and made my way into the first dungeon of the game, Dragon Roost Cavern. This dungeon was pretty chill, being the first one in the game and all. I did get a little worried in this one room with the rats, because the hint stone told me that I should try to lure out the rats with bait, which I didn't bother picking up at this point because I didn't think I needed it. So for a second, I thought that I would need to leave the island to try and hunt down Beetle. Luckily though, I did not need to do that, and was just able to chuck a flaming stick across the room to catch some wood on fire in order to progress. Before long, I made it to the boss, which was pretty simple, where after a few smashes to the noggin, I took it out. From here, I was really itching to get the Swift Sail, so I decided to make the trek all the way up to Windfall Island to try and win it in the auction. Once docked, I made my way over to the Elvis impersonator to learn the Song of Passing, to make it nighttime, and headed straight to the auction house, which is only open at night. After a few resets in the auction house where I came across some useless items I did not need, I finally came upon the Swift Sail, and I was ecstatic. Finally I can sail across the Great Sea seamlessly. But there was a problem. I didn't have enough rupees to win the auction. I was outbid towards the end of the auction and couldn't afford the new sail that I desired, where I only had 178 rupees, and in order to win it, you need around like 300 rupees. I was trying to beat the game as quickly as possible up until that point, that I neglected collecting rupees. This was a bit of a time loss because I went out of my way to go back to Windfall Island to try to win the sail. So slightly irritated, I slowly sailed my way to the island of the next dungeon, Forest Haven. This next dungeon was a breeze, and is honestly hardly worth talking about. I did a lot of flying around with the Korok leaf, trapped some particularly sad looking fairies in a bottled prison, and took out this jellyfish looking boss creature to beat the dungeon. From here, I actually had an excuse to go back to Windfall Island, because I needed to have a run-in with the pirates there to progress the story, and it was conveniently nighttime by the time I got there. So I tried going into the auction house to try for the Swift Sail again, and well, they were closed due to the storm. Go figure. So once observing the pirates mug Mickey Mouse, I learned the super secret password to get onto the pirate ship, which they kept repeating an absurdly hilarious amount of times during the cutscene, and stole the bombs with the help of my favorite looking friend. I also went ahead and sold a bunch of items to Beetle because I didn't even want to risk not being able to buy the Swift Sail during my next opportunity. From here, I made the long sail over to Outset Islands, where I needed to bomb a wall to get Nehru's Pearl. I was also a good grandson and healed my grandma with a fairy because I sort of just felt bad. And she does make some super banging soup, which I made sure to stock up on. And from here, I started the long sail around the Great Sea, putting the 3 pearls I collected in their respective statues. Luckily, the storm stopped while I was doing this, so when I was close to Windfall Island again, I went straight over to the auction house. After only the third reset of the auctions, I came across the Swift Sale, which was super lucky because I've heard horror stories of people online resetting the room like 20 or 30 times until they have the Swift Sale spawn, which is super brutal. So after waiting until the very last second to put in my bid, I was able to cop the Swift Sale and sail around at breakneck speed. Before I got the fast sail, whenever I had to sail to an island, I would just sort of be AFK and eat food or something, while the game takes me from place to place, which you could actually do, because it's not like you'll really run into enemies that could do much damage in the sea. But the Swift Sail was nice because most of the time, I would just stare at my screen, wanting the slow loading screen of the Great Sea to be over with as quickly as possible. Before I left Windfall Island though, I checked the mail to see a letter from Grandma, where she gave me 20 rupees as her money that she's been saving up. But at this point, I was maxed out on rupees, so I literally just threw the money on the ground, which is pretty sad and hilarious at the same time. But I mean, I saved Grandma with the fairy, so it has to balance out at least, right? So from here, I did some more puzzling around, took out this giant floating head with disembodied hands that brought me Bongo Bongo war flashbacks, and solved this super easy block pushing puzzle to reveal the path to the Master Sword. I mean honestly, even one of these bozos could have solved this thing with how easy it was, where I'm surprised the Master Sword wasn't taken a long time ago. Now, I made my way back to the Forsaken Fortress for the second time, and despite already having been there, I actually got lost again for a bit, which was pretty alarming to say the least. I didn't realize that you could cross gaps like this with a Korok leaf, until I was grasping at straws and trying random stuff. It was something so simple, and I was here running around, breaking every little pot and checking under each of these bed sheets, thinking I'd find some hidden nugget of information tucked away somewhere. And to top things off, during my climb up to the tower, my finger accidentally slipped, and I clutched the Korok leaf and narrowly avoided falling and losing a bunch of progress, which was a glimmer of happiness in the sea of sorrow of being lost in the fortress for the past like 30 to 40 minutes. Also, this mini blend just straight up yeeted himself off a cliff for no reason whatsoever, which is pretty hilarious. Once at the top of the tower, I took out the giant bird, saved Link's sister, and sat through the super long cutscene of Ganondorf being scorched alive. I don't know why Nintendo didn't let you skip cutscenes in this remake. That would have been super helpful in this run, where those cutscenes really add up over time. From here, I witnessed Tetra's stupidity as she tried to follow Link without understanding how stairs work, and witnessed her transform into Princess Zelda, marking me playing Wind Waker for about 6.5 hours at this point. And honestly, I wasn't feeling the Zelda fatigue as much this morning. This trend sort of continued for each day to come, where once I got a good night's rest, for the first half of the next day, I would feel fine and energized, but it wouldn't be until the afternoon and evening time for each day, where I would feel sluggish and every small little thing would annoy me. Also, it doesn't help that I sort of timed it where I've been beating each of these games towards the end of each day, where the end of each game is usually the hardest part and requires the most focus. So after obtaining the Master Sword, I did some sailing around to my next destination, and accidentally ran into this giant squid thing, which yielded me an upgraded magic meter when I defeated it. That wasn't really what I was looking for, but I took it nonetheless. For the next 2.5 hours or so, I cleared the Earth Temple and Wind Temple, which aren't really worth dwelling too much on, because nothing out of the ordinary really happened during my playthrough. I will say though, that accidentally stumbling across the magic meter upgrade in the Great Sea was a godsend for the Wind Temple, and I would have run out of magic an unfortunate number of times without that upgrade, with all the flying around you have to do with your Korok leaf item. Now began the infamously hated section of this game, the hunt for the 8 Triforce shards scattered across the Great Sea. And I don't know if those haters of this portion of the game played a totally different game, but this has always been my absolute favorite section of the game for me. Tingle gives you a Triforce chart, which shows you the general area to find each Triforce shard, so it's not like you're blindly searching for them or anything. And this quest to find all the shards was a fun excuse to explore the islands by sailing around. I will say though, that this Triforce hunt was pretty time consuming, and took almost 2.5 hours for me, but I did know the exact location of most of the Triforce shards, because I have played this game before. Another reason why I chose to play the Wii U Wind Waker is that this Triforce Shard quest is quite a bit quicker compared to how it is in the GameCube version. In the GameCube version, you have to hunt down 8 Triforce charts and pay 398 rupees to decode each one, where you'll end up paying a total of 3,184 rupees to decode all of them. In the Wii U version, instead of having to decode 8 Triforce charts, this has been reduced to 3, but each still costs 398 rupees to decode. For one Triforce shard, I was in a pickle. You have to give 20 joy pendants to this lady at Windfall Island in exchange for entry into her cabana, but I only had 14 of them in hand, because earlier on in the game, I wasn't thinking and sold almost all of them to Beetle because I wanted more money to buy the Swift Sale. Talk about not good planning. so I had to travel to Dragon Roost Island to farm 6 extra joy pendants from bokoblins using my grappling hook. Once actually in the cabana though, I had a hard time trying to figure out where the actual Triforce shard was. There's this puzzle game that you can play, so I tried solving it, and after like 10 minutes, I was rewarded with 50 rupees, which was absolutely useless, because I had enough rupees for the Triforce charts with all of my items I could sell to Beetle. There are 16 light bulb things next to the painting, so I was sure I wouldn't have to solve every single last puzzle to get the Triforce shard, right? I was hopeful this was the case, and after searching around the cabana for a bit more, I realized there was a lever hanging from the ceiling that you could use to access a hidden area below, which contains the Triforce shard. You already know there's at least a few dozen sorry souls out there who didn't think to look up to find this lever, and spent the whole 4 or 5 hours or so slaving away to solve every single one of these sliding puzzles. That's a sad existence I don't even want to think of being a part of. After getting 7 of the Triforce shards, I found the ghost ship chart on Diamond Step Island, after playing a literal game of pick a pipe in a Zelda game, and took out some baddies to get the 8th and final Triforce shard, allowing myself to finally have the tools to infiltrate Ganon's tower. This dungeon started out really well, where the 4 fights against previous bosses I defeated were easy enough, but I did have some trouble with Phantom Ganon. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to actually kill him, where for whatever reason, his sword would get left behind and I couldn't figure out how to destroy it for the life of me, until it finally clicked. I totally forgot that the direction his sword falls points to what room you need to go next. That takes super out of the box thinking, and even though I got stuck on it for a while, I couldn't even get mad at Nintendo because that was a pretty ingenious puzzle concept. So after using my light arrows to take down Phantom Ganon once and for all, at least in this game, I climbed up Ganondorf's red carpeted stairs to the real final boss fight. First was the puppet Ganon fight, which went pretty well for the most part, except Testu's gift really hit the fan during his caterpillar phase, where you have to snipe the tip of his tail with your light arrows as he slithers around extremely fast in random directions. It was so hard to shoot the thing, and by the beginning of that phase all the way until the end when I finally took it out, I went from almost full health to almost depleted health. This didn't give me a good feeling with the final stand against Ganondorf coming up, but I was able to heal up with fairies that I found along the top deck, which definitely eased my worries. I was a little over 13 hours of playing Wind Waker for the day, so dying to the final boss and having to redo anything would have been absolutely soul-crushing at this point. The final stand against Ganondorf actually went really well, and went about as good as I would have expected, but something interesting happened right at the end of the fight. Check this out. I got hit and lost all of my hearts almost exactly the same time the finishing blow against Ganondorf started. I had a fairy in a bottle, which saved me, luckily enough, but imagine how bad it would feel to get this far into the fight, only to die less than a second before you beat the game. I don't even want to think about that possibility. So this whole third day of the challenge consisted of me starting and beating Wind Waker, which took a total of 13.5 hours. So 1 hour more than how much time I spent in the previous 2 days. By the time I finished the game, I was glad that I had completed Wind Waker that day, because despite me being tired and having a headache, I really wanted to start the next day with a fresh game and a fresh mindset after a good night's rest. So with that, I called it a night and decided to continue with the challenge in the morning. The next morning, I started my playthrough of Twilight Princess, and similar to Wind Waker, I'll be playing the Wii U version. The Wii U version doesn't really have any major differences that would drastically quicken my playthrough of Twilight Princess compared to the Wii and GameCube versions, but there were a decent number of minor things that I thought it might as well be worth it to play the Wii U version for this video. I will say that there is one extremely useful feature in Twilight Princess that for whatever reason, Nintendo decided to not include in the previous 3 3D Zelda games, and that is skippable cutscenes. Finally, I can blast through long cutscenes to streamline this challenge, instead of just staring at my screen with my eyes glazed over. Twilight Princess is extremely cutscene heavy too, so this was a very nice feature. When I first started moving around as Link though, I quickly noticed how different this game was compared to what I remembered. This was one of my childhood games that I grew up with, that I played to death on the original Wii, and it was the 3rd or 4th Zelda game that I've ever played. I have little experience playing it on the Wii U, but when I played it for this challenge, I noticed that every single little thing is mirrored, including the maps, the hand Link holds his sword, heck, even this kid wears their bandana on the other side of their head. I haven't played this game in over 10 years on the Wii, but I was surprised at how many times I would roll into a wall because I would subconsciously remember a path being there, when it was actually mirrored to be on the other side of the map. Like you would think I would lose the muscle memory of the Wii U version after all these years. But anyway, the beginning sequence in Ordon Village went how it usually does. I learned how to Z-target from 5-hit here, made a bird come to a screeching halt after hitting a blade of grass, and harassed a pregnant lady who might as well have been moving backwards due to how slowly she walked. You know, the typical life on the ranch for Link. I needed to have enough rupees to buy the slingshot, so I began smashing pumpkins to search for rupees, until I got harassed for wasting food in a video game. So I smashed some more pumpkins anyway, bought a slingshot, had a relaxing evening of herding goats, and good god, I somehow went from an innocent country bumpkin to a wolf chained in a prison in a matter of seconds. I did skip through minutes worth of cutscenes to get to this point, but imagine someone playing this game for the first time and accidentally skipping the cutscene leading up to Wolf Link. Like, they'd have to be extremely confused and wondering if they were playing the same game. This Wolf Link section, where you have to find Princess Zelda with Midna, went easy enough, but it made me realize how frequently block-pushing puzzles exist in Zelda games, where Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Wind Waker had a bunch of them. Like, I couldn't even name you a Zelda game that doesn't have a slow block-pushing puzzle, where you slowly push a block across a room to progress. Or maybe me taking on this challenge had me hyper aware of their time-wasting existence. After reuniting with Zelda, I got my revenge on the townsfolk for not letting me smash their pumpkins, took on a career with pest control, almost got poisoned to death by a hillbilly in the woods, and made my way into the first dungeon of the game after about almost an hour and a half of gameplay for the day. And honestly, I thought I was making good pace at this point. People tend to complain that this beginning section of the game is a slow and drawn out process, but with the power of being able to skip cutscenes, I was able to knock it out somewhat quickly. This first dungeon went nicely overall, and with the power of monkey gymnastics, I was able to knock it out without much sweat. This dungeon did introduce something that I learned to despise even more than the stray fairies from Majora's Mask: stamps. Oh, the stamps. In Majora's Mask, the stray fairies at least bring you to full health when you collect one, but the stamps from Twilight Princess are absolutely useless to me in this challenge, and Miiverse isn't even a thing anymore anyway, where you could post the stamps you collect. Also, it doesn't help that the stamps are always placed in the important looking big chest, so more often than not, I would go out of my way to get a chest thinking it would be a key or something, when it just ended up being a useless piece of nothing. Once I killed the boss in the dungeon, I went back to the hillbilly who almost murdered me, and bought a bottle from him for safety strats that I put a fairy in for the rest of the game, in the off chance that I died. Out of all the games I played for this video, Twilight Princess probably has to be the one that had me the most worried on how much time it could potentially take to finish. Based on polls of people who played this game in the past, a rushed playthrough takes a little over 28 hours, so in a 7-day challenge where I had to beat 7 long Zelda games, this had me worried, and I was skeptical that this game would bleed over into the next day. As I was traversing Hyrule Field to my next destination, I came across another obstacle that I would learn to despise more and more as I played. The mailman. The guy who stalks Link around, and stops your progress dead in your tracks whenever he gets the chance. Each time you run into him, the interaction only lasts like 30 seconds or so, but given that he stops you 20 or 30 times during the whole game, the time spent with this guy certainly adds up. Another thing that I couldn't help noticing is how Epona controls in this game. I would eventually get used to how she controls, making traversing across Hyrule Field a breeze, but she does feel like you're driving a semi-truck at times. Like, just look at this. I can't even make it across the bridge. Her movement sensitivity is really low compared to your joystick inputs, so when you want to turn in a certain direction, you really have to hold that direction for a while. And earlier on in the game when I wasn't used to this, I felt like walking from place to place would have been faster, rather than maneuver Epona between tight spaces. After some more pest control, I slapped around Cue Ball in exchange for his boots. Used said boots to slap around a dried out wrinkled raisin, in order to make it to the next dungeon, Goron Mines. Goron Mines was nothing to write home about, except it had me fully realize Nintendo's bad history with the Iron Boots. In Ocarina of Time, you had to spend time opening and closing the pause menu to equip them, while in Twilight Princess, you get this. Yeah, let's just say, whenever I had to walk around with the Iron Boots, it felt like a chore. Eventually I was able to beat the dungeon, bought the Hylian shield from a little person for style points, because I had just enough rupees, and didn't need them for anything else, coasted backwards down a waterfall for even more style points, and received the bomb bag that I used to store water bombs in, to gain access into the third dungeon, Lakebed Temple. And boy, this dungeon was something alright. This dungeon has water level changing mechanics similar to Ocarina of Time's Water Temple, where you have to manipulate a center staircase by pouring water into the correct room at the correct time. I started out pretty strong, where I was able to make it all the way to the mini-boss and get the claw shot item without a crazy amount of difficulty. Things started to go haywire though, when I began the monstrous undertaking to find the small key for this door right here. I literally spent around like 45 minutes searching every little nook and cranny, opening up every single chest, trying to find a small key that I didn't have for this door, and oh, that was the door to the dungeon's boss? This whole time, I was looking for a small key that didn't even exist, when I had the boss key in my inventory the whole time. I felt pretty dumb at this point, but could you honestly blame me? The boss door doesn't have a massive lock like other dungeons, and from far away, it looks basically identical to a small key lock. Like, you can't tell me there's really a difference here. Also, I never really went up to the lock to inspect it closely, because I'd have to jump down in the water to do so I only ever watched it from a distance as it would taunt me. Additionally, I was neck deep in a 7-day challenge at this point, so my critical thinking wasn't up to par at this point, and the Zelda fatigue was in full force. The search around Lakebed Temple for the elusive non-existent missing key wasn't without its hardships as well, where I painstakingly trekked all the way up this winding path with my super slow iron boots just to find, you guessed it, a stamp. I honestly felt like the game was trolling me at this point. During my long walk up the stream, I even accidentally unequipped my iron boots, trying to take out my claw shot, causing me to slide all the way down back to the bottom again. I even checked enough chests looking for the key that I accidentally got 5 heart pieces by this point, which netted me a full heart container. This was pretty unexpected, but it didn't end up being all that useful in the grand scheme of things, because Twilight Princess's combat sections are pretty easy overall. So after opening every single chest in Lakebed Temple, and finally wising up with the boss door, I took out the boss without much trouble, saved Midna's life, and made my way to the Sacred Grove to retrieve the Master Sword. Except there was an obstacle blocking my way. These guys. The puzzle to rule all puzzles. I remember as a kid being totally lost whenever I got to this point in the game, where you have to move Wolf Link around to get both statues to stand in the correct spot at the same time. I don't think I ever completed this section as a kid without looking up how to do it online, and this is miles ahead in terms of brain power compared to the puzzle in Wind Waker that you have to complete to access the Master Sword in that game. Despite my history with this puzzle though, I was surprisingly able to knock it out in a little over 5 minutes. I sort of felt like I got a little lucky, because things kind of just fell into place and worked out, to be honest. Either way, I took the win, took the Master Sword from its pedestal, watched a couple more mailman cutscenes, bribed a crooked clown to shoot me out of a cannon, and made my way into the next dungeon in no time, Arbiter's Grounds. This dungeon wasn't nearly as time consuming as Lakebed Temple, and reminded me a lot of the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, with all those Poes you have to defeat to allow for their souls to light up lanterns in the central area. Oh, and you also get a Beyblade in this dungeon, which is pretty sick. Snow Peak Ruins was the next area of the game, and being that this was an ice dungeon, and this is a 3D Zelda game, you already know there were going to be some ice block pushing puzzles in this one, which I spent an unfortunate amount of time trying to figure out. I helped the abominable snowman make some soup, received a physics lesson on the nature of frictionless surfaces, and showed some ice monsters who's boss, all before I witnessed true love in its most pure form. So wholesome. The Temple of Time was my next destination and went pretty well. It was mostly just a game of follow the leader, where I obtained the Dominion Rod, but it really sucked for me towards the end, where I forgot to get the boss key by the time I made it to the boss door, so I had to backtrack all the way up towards the top of the dungeon in order to track it down, which ended up taking an extra like 15 minutes, but it felt like it took longer. Or honestly, I didn't even know at this point. At this point in the challenge, I was almost 11 hours into the 4th day, and the days were just sort of blending together, and I was sort of losing track of time. The general formula of the games that I was playing were so similar that it sort of felt like I was just playing the same kind of thing over and over again, with endless dungeons, and puzzles to solve, and monsters to fight, and dungeons, and monsters, and puzzles, and dungeons, and puzzles, and you get my point. I was wanting to call it quits for the day, but I wanted to make at least a couple more hours of progress to match my game time of the previous 3 days, so I decided to press on. The next order of business was accessing the City in the Sky, or as I like to call it, Uka-Palooza. Come on, I had to have a little bit of fun to get me through these 7 days. The gameplay leading up to the Sky Dungeon was actually pretty long, which was unfortunate, which consisted of me waiting next to Hyrule Castle for it to be dark, so that I could find a creepy looking wooden doll thing, playing some Red Dead Redemption, and finding 6 Sky characters scattered all throughout Hyrule. Finding the 6 Sky characters wasn't very hard, because it's just a matter of visiting 6 locations marked on your map of previous places you visited, but at this point in the challenge, it just felt like an annoying fetch quest and a waste of time. Every little thing was annoying me at this point, so pardon my complaining, but I found it pretty bizarre that in the hidden village, when the old lady comes out of her house, you have to leave the entire village to be able to warp away as Wolf Link, because apparently she can still see when you're hundreds of feet away behind multiple buildings. I'm pretty sure that was just an oversight by the developers. So despite me being annoyed at coming across it during the challenge, I can honestly look back at it and laugh now. Before long, I was shot into the cosmos by a cannon into City in the Sky. I remembered having a super hard time with this dungeon as a kid, but luckily, I was able to remember how to progress through some particularly tricky areas without getting totally lost. Like in this one area towards the ends, you have to be aware of your surroundings enough to latch onto the ceiling with your claw shot, lower yourself, and use your second claw shot to pull a lever to turn on a fan. It's so easy to just jump down here without seeing the lever that you need to pull. Even though I was able to beat the dungeon without many issues, it still took me around a whole hour, and I was feeling pretty tired at this point in the day. So the last thing I did for day 4 was enter the Mirror of Twilight to get to the Palace of Twilight dungeon. My playtime was almost about 13 hours for the day, which was on par with the time I spent playing games for the previous 3 days, but not beating Twilight Princess on day 4 made me feel behind. Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are massive beasts of games, and I knew I had to pick up the pace here soon to have any hope of completing the challenge in time. But at this point, I wasn't prepared for the intense hardship that was soon to come. After a good night's rest, I picked up immediately where I left off in the Palace of Twilight in Twilight Princess, and was energized and hoping to make a massive dent in these games. I didn't think I would totally finish Skyward Sword this day, given how long Twilight Princess took, but I was hoping to get to Skyward Sword this day as soon as possible. The Palace of Twilight went without issue, and required little to no brain power because the whole thing was super linear. The only potential annoyance was these hand guys that you have to prevent from stealing the magic glowing gumball looking thing, but they moved super slow and never caught up to me. At the end of the dungeon, you fight Zant in a multiple phase fight where you teleport around to boss arenas that you've seen previously in the game. I was well stocked on heart containers with the many dungeons I had completed already, so I knocked him out without too much sweat and headed to the final stand at Hyrule Castle, where I... Are you kidding me? I was just about to head to Hyrule Castle to confront Ganondorf to try and save Hyrule when the postman guy had the guts to interrupt me. With 3 letters in fact. Anyway, back to the task at hand. The trek leading up to the final boss fight was pretty much all combat, where you had to stand against Ganondorf's last line of defense of baddies, but there was also this maze with dead guys pointing in the direction you need to go, which was a cool callback to the Majora's Mask's signpost maze in the Great Bay Area. So after taking down a few more Dark Nuts, I found myself in the boss chamber to take on the final challenge of the game. This boss fight is actually super long, where you face Princess Zelda herself in a game of ping pong, munch on Beast Ganon's comically large weak spot, and fight Ganondorf on horseback, until you have the final face-off with him in sword combat. This final phase can actually be pretty hard to get Ganondorf to reveal his weak spot, but I had one secret weapon that made the Dark Lord himself quake in his boots, the fishing rod. Yes, this little thing that you can use to catch a fish for the kitty cat at the very beginning of the game. For those that don't know, if you take out your fishing rod and wave it around in Ganondorf's face, he gets all, ooh, shiny, and gets distracted, allowing you to get hits in with your sword. So all you have to do is rinse and repeat this 10 or so times, and the fight's over. Far from a climactic ending, but I'm honestly glad I was catching a break at this point. It only took me a little over an hour and a half to finish Twilight Princess the morning of the 5th day, and it felt super good to finish such a long game. I didn't have long to celebrate though, because I still had 3 more Zelda games to beat, continuing things with Skyward Sword. For Skyward Sword, I had the choice between playing the Wii version or the Switch version. I decided to play the Switch version for your viewing pleasure. The fact that the Switch version has quite a bit of quality of life improvements that speed up the gameplay, and quite frankly, I don't want the fate of this run to be put in the hands of spotty motion controls. So I did map the sword to the control stick for this playthrough, because that seemed more reliable. Also, if you weren't already aware, Skyward Sword lets you skip most cutscenes, which I will be taking complete advantage of. I totally skipped the super long opening cutscene, and headed my way out of my room to start the adventure. From here, I did some typical beginning of the game shenanigans where I met Princess Zelda, or at least I think I did because I skipped a cutscene, accidentally talked to an eggplant, and kicked butt in the wing ceremony to get the sailcloth, aka Paraglider Beta Edition. As a means of celebrating my victory, I went on a night stroll through Skyloft until I suddenly got attacked by a kitten, and immediately got my revenge. I then found a shiny new sword, was gifted the adventure pouch by a talking Q-tip, ignored the warnings of a talking robot urging me to buy potions, and plunged to the surface below the clouds. Down on the surface, you are tasked with finding these Kikwi creatures in a game of hide and seek. Being that I haven't played this game in over 10 years, I actually got lost for a bit in the forest trying to find these little guys. There's this tracking device feature called dowsing that you can use, which points towards their exact location, but more often than not, they would be located in some nook or cranny that you have to take some specific path to get to, so the dowsing ability wasn't the most helpful. Eventually, I found all of them though, reported back to their head honcho, retrieved the slingshot item from his butt tail looking thing, and made my way into the first dungeon, Skyview Temple. Out of all the things this game is praised for, and when I say all, that doesn't account for much, because it seems like a large amount of people online say they don't like this game, the biggest strong suit of Skyward Sword goes to its dungeons. Even when I was trying to blast through them as quickly as possible, I couldn't help but marvel at their immersive atmosphere, uniqueness, and complex design. Granted, in this game, you still have your standard forest area, fire area, and desert area. Heck, there isn't even a snow area this time, but the game's dungeons expand on this through themes, such as traveling through an abandoned mine in the present, as you had to hit time shift stones to go into the ancient past, a water temple with heavy Buddhism symbolism, and a dungeon where you play pirate and literally have to explore from the crow's nest all the way to the poop deck. And well, some creature straight from Monsters Inc. also makes an appearance in this game. I mean, come on, the thing even has a double chin. Those stack of patties alone make that thing a laughingstock, and not a fearsome sea monster by any means, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Skyview Temple, the first dungeon in the game, wasn't all that spectacular, and gave off beginner dungeon vibes. I pretended to be Tarzan for a bit, confused Girahim's laughingstock of a security system with my pointy sword, and performed my 53rd block pushing puzzle this week. This dungeon also introduced an interesting item of the Beetle, where you can fly around to interact with things far away. It reminds me a lot of those seagulls you can control in the Wind Waker, but this thing was far more utilized in Skyward Sword, and created some interesting puzzle concepts. I'd also say in general, Skyward Sword has really cool and innovative items not seen in any other Zelda game. You still have your bow, slingshot, and bombs, but there's a lot of cool new ones like a whip to teach those bokoblins who's boss, magma mitts to burrow in the ground like a mole person, and even a giant duster because who doesn't like to play house and clean up pesky dust. But by the end of the first dungeon, I distracted Girahim with my sword, and took him out and made my way straight over to the fire area. And well, as soon as I made my way into Elden Volcano, I made my first mistake, bringing wood equipment into a literal volcano. So yes, my shield burned up in flames almost instantly. I could have made a pit stop to the bazaar and bought the shield from this fellow, who looks oddly similar to a certain someone, but we're all about speed in this challenge, and I've always thought of Skyward Sword as an easy baby game, so I decided against it. Also, it's not like shields are even that super necessary in this game anyway. They can just make combat a little bit easier. So as I made my way through the volcano, I chucked some bombs in the chimneys of some locals, got my fingertips stomped by a bokoblin as I slid down a long slope on my back, completely motionless. I mean, come on, Link's 1,000-yard stare with his eyes wide open says it all. And I entered the second dungeon, the Earth Temple, which should probably be called a Fire Temple with all the, well, you know, fire and lava everywhere, but that would just make too much sense to name it that, now wouldn't it? This dungeon went as well as I would have expected, except I spent an embarrassingly long amount of time at this section here, where you have to chuck a bomb on a platform at just the right time, where as it gets raised up by the lava, the bomb blows up a blocked path. For whatever reason, it took me forever to get the timing right, and when I finally got it, the reward was underwhelming to say the least. It was a golden skull item, which in a normal playthrough would be pretty valuable, but it was absolutely worthless to me. Towards the end of the dungeon, I broke my back from a giant rolling boulder because apparently you're supposed to run to the side to get out of its way, which is kinda dumb, and then I took on the boss, which looks oddly similar to Mike Wazowski. I mean, come on, what's with Nintendo and all the Monsters Inc. references in this game? Heck, they even have this same creature, and they both don't even have legs. I then made my way over to the third main area of the game, Lanu, a sandy wasteland full of electricity, and lots of electricity. It was here where I met the bane of my existence for the game, these bokoblins with these electricity wand things. The combat in this game is based on motion controls, where you have to swing your sword the correct way to do damage, but with these guys, if you swing in the wrong direction, you'll hit their wand and you will take damage. Literally every time I had to fight one of these things, I would take damage, because it seems as though they can predict exactly where your sword swing will be. Like I couldn't tell you how many times I would swing my sword, and they would move their wand to that direction immediately, as my blade came towards them. Super annoying. And I almost died numerous occasions due to them. Like I was at 2 hearts during the majority of my time in Lanu. This next dungeon was nothing special, except I took quite a large amount of damage that I'll just blame on not having a shield. Surprisingly, I didn't actually game over in this area, despite me being at 1 heart for like 10 to 15 minutes of the dungeon at one point. After this dungeon, I took down a fuzzy avocado monster for the first time out of 3 in this game, returned to Skyloft and talked to Lord Farquaad in exchange for an empty bottle, because I almost died in Lanu and wanted a place to store fairies, bought a shield for safety in case I needed it, and increased my bomb capacity by 5 because I had the spare rupees, and only being able to hold 10 seemed a little low. Also at this point, I realized a large majority of the game has been spent with my sword glowing blue because that was Fee trying to get my attention. In the Switch port of Skyward Sword, they toned down the annoyingness of Fee with their constant interruptions, so at least in the Switch version, they give you the option if you want to talk to her or not. And I knew her wanting to talk to me was probably some useless bit of information, like her telling me the probability of when Link's next bathroom break will be or something, so I decided to ignore her almost completely the entire game. At this point in the game, you have to do a pretty easy and bland quest of fixing the robot and repairing a couple of windmills that I'll glance over briefly. I did forget to pick up an ancient flower in Lanu, which is required to fix the robot, which kinda sucked, so I had to do a bit of backtracking, but before I knew it, I made it to the puzzle area where you learn a song to access the first Silent Realm area of the game. This puzzle is basically Twilight Princess's equivalent to the area where you have to move the giant stone guys to the same spot. I remember struggling with this puzzle in Skyward Sword a bunch when I played this game as a kid on the Wii, but in this playthrough, I was literally able to solve it in little over a minute. Like, it's really not even that bad and is nothing compared to the Twilight Princess one, if you just give it a bit of thought and plan ahead your actions. Once that was done, I made my way straight to the Faron Wood Silent Realm, the first of 4 Silent Realm challenges, which sort of remind me of those wolf sections in Twilight Princess where you had to kill those bug things. In Skyward Sword, you have to be stealthy and use your time wisely to collect some fruit before you get hit and have to start the whole area from scratch. This was super nerve-wracking for me in my playthrough, because if I collected all of the fruit and blundered and got hit, that would cause me to lose a significant amount of time, because it can take a while to collect all 15 or so sacred tears scattered across the map. Luckily, the first Silent Realm was the easiest out of all of them, but I couldn't guarantee the same out of the ones to come. After this, I talked to a Kikwi who looks like someone took a steamy dump on his head, swam around like a dolphin, which looks a bit ridiculous I might add, and made my way through the first dungeon of the game a second time to fetch some sacred water for a spoiled princess dragon lady. The next dungeon was the Ancient Cistern, which I won't dwell on too much because I already touched on earlier. It's one of the best dungeons in the game, albeit not too hard, except for the life of me, I couldn't figure out the puzzle to open this door. All the clue says is to strike the gemstones in, quote, the temple's secret order, which is probably the most obscure hint I've ever heard. Like, no kidding. Of course you have to hit them in a secret order. I just ended up brute forcing my way through by testing all the possible combinations, which took like 5 minutes or so. And to this day, I don't know how you're supposed to know the correct order without trial and error. So from here, I took on arguably the most epic boss fight in Zelda, where you hack apart this giant multi-armed metal giant, and made my way over to where my playthrough of this game gets really interesting and tense, the Lanu Silent Realm. This area started out really strong for me. The general path you have to take is very linear, where from the starting area, you have to travel in a pretty set path, and once you have all the sacred tears collected, you're supposed to make the trek all the way back to the starting platform to mark the area as cleared. But I had a slight problem. Once I found the last sacred tear and opened up the finish line gate, I didn't know how to get back. In order to get the last sacred tear, you have to jump down from an elevated surface, and I didn't know how to get back up again because I didn't have access to any of my items. So as I was trying to make my way back to where I came from, I found myself in a minefield of enemies trying to track me down and slay me, and well, I'll just let it play out for you to watch. I spent minutes, which felt like hours, trying to find my way back safely, dodging these hooded giant monsters with scythes, until I finally found out that you can run in the sand and run up and climb this wall. Like, I can't be the first person that didn't know you'd be able to get up this way. But my trek to safety wasn't over yet. Music to my ears. I was almost certain I would get hit and lose like 15 or 20 minutes of progress, which would have been so soul-crushing at this point. I had felt like I had been playing 3D Zelda for ages at this point, and even the most minor of setbacks like a 15-minute time loss would have been enough to make me incredibly unmotivated and unnerved. But by this point of barely making it out alive, and full of energy and adrenaline, I sailed my way over to the hardest dungeon in the game, for me at least, the Sandship. This dungeon really requires you to be aware of your surroundings, where you have to travel between floors inside and outside of the ship, while shifting between past and present in order to access certain areas. Also, this dungeon made me super glad that I bought a shield while at the bazaar in Skyloft a bit earlier in the day, because I'm pretty sure a shield is required to take down the mini-boss, where you have to counter with your shield when he swings his sword at you. If I didn't have a shield at this point, I would have had to get killed by the guy purposely, exit the dungeon, warp all the way to Skyloft, buy a shield, and backtrack all the way through the dungeon again to the mini-boss, which would have sucked a bunch. With my shield, I took the guy down with no problem, but this dungeon deepened my hatred for the electric bokoblins, because they were literally everywhere. Like, look at this guy. Looking back at the footage in slow motion, it looks like I swung my sword, and he moved his electric rod to block my attack after I already started my sword swing, but I still got hit. Talk about frustrating. I started to just run by these guys and totally avoid them, only attacking them where I absolutely had to in order to progress. After some puzzling around though, I made my way over to this abomination, and it actually gave me quite a bit of trouble. The first phase went well enough, but just look at how the second phase went. I totally didn't realize that in the second phase, when those snake tentacles come out, you could just hack at them with your sword. I thought you had to charge a Skyward Strike, which I didn't have enough time to pull off before I took damage, and even got down to half a heart, which is absolutely insane, so I took out the boss and was out of there. If you thought the Lanu Desert Silent Realm was tense, you wouldn't believe how the Elden Volcano one went. Naturally, these areas get harder and harder as the game progresses, so this one wasn't a cakewalk by any means. Being that the map is pretty large, the sacred tiers are pretty far apart, and if you go more than 90 seconds without collecting one, and you still have more to collect, you enter death mode, and all of the baddies in the map fly towards you, trying to kill you to send you all the way back to the beginning. Similar to the Lanu Silent Realm, this one didn't start out bad, but it wasn't until my 9th sacred tier until I started experiencing problems. If you collect these fruit laying on the grounds, you're able to see a beacon of the exact location of other sacred tiers for 30 seconds, but they were super far away, and I wasn't sure how to get to them, so I spent the next 90 seconds wandering around the volcano, and just see for yourself. I was almost certain that I would die, because I was just blindly running around and trying to find the next tier. With the new area unlocked that I hadn't explored yet, I was feeling pretty confident in myself. I was able to collect the next few tiers without much issue. I had 3 more left to collect though, and had 2 in my sight until, well, just see for yourself. Wow, that was close. My journey wasn't over yet though, where I still had one tier left to find with dozens of enemies with spotlights in my way, trying to track me down. So I ran up the sandy slope, saw the last sacred tier ahead of me, and picked it up. Sprinting back down the slope went without troubles, so I exited the Silent Realm without having to start over, and immediately saved my progress, because I did not want to go through that again. In the next area of the game, I discovered my second most hated thing in the game, next to the electric goblins, Scrapper the robot. In Elden Volcano, you had to guide him around the map, on a pretty long journey, I might add, to dump a basin of water at the dungeon's entrance in order to be able to enter it, because apparently he can't fly there from the sky himself, and you have to go on this long voyage of playing babysitter, and make sure this delicate guy doesn't crack like an egg. I mean seriously, I made it pretty far with him when he decided to give a speared moblin a hug and not move out of the way as he was getting attacked. He just heckled me to help him as he stood there stationary without putting any effort into defending himself. Also, it doesn't help that when you lead him around, he constantly gets mad at you for going too fast, because apparently he can keep up in the sky when you fly at 50 miles per hour on a bird, but he can't keep up when Link walks like 5 miles per hour on foot. And what happens when he gets attacked too many times? He gets sent to the very beginning of the Follow the Leader section and had to start it all over again. Luckily though, I only had to restart the section one time and entered the next dungeon, the Fire Sanctuary. This dungeon was one of my favorites in the game, and that's saying a lot for me at this point, because it was nearing the end of the 5th day, and I was feeling pretty burnt out with Zelda at this point. You had to save these mole men, which are a callback to saving the Gorons in the Fire Temple from Ocarina of Time, which is pretty cool. There's one section that took me quite a while to figure out, and that's the room with these fruit. There's this frog that you had to splash water on, and the fruit produced water when destroyed, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to transport the fruit to the frog tongue thing. I tried literally every item in my arsenal when I finally figured out that apparently you can just stab them with your sword and then fling them wherever you want. This game never tells you this is even a mechanic that would work, so I'm not sure how the heck they'd expect anyone to figure that out on their own. Luckily, it didn't take me more than like 10 minutes to figure it out, so I took out gear at him again, and well, what do you know? Another dumb Scrapper Follow the Leader mission, except this time, he carries a giant pumpkin. Luckily, this one wasn't nearly as frustrating or long, where at the end of it, you feed some soup to a giant flying whale. Sound familiar? This fight was pretty easy, except my shield broke, which kinda sucked. So in order to not take any chances in the endgame, I bought another shield in Skyloft. I also went ahead and bought an upgraded quiver, because I didn't need to buy anything else before the end of the game, and I had leftover rupees, so why not? At this point in the run, I was feeling pretty drained, with a slight headache, where I had been playing 3D Zelda for roughly 12.5 hours that day, and had been playing games for about 64 hours over the course of the past 5 days, which is absolutely insane looking back at it. I decided to push on a bit more for the rest of the day, because I still had a couple more games to get through, so I took down the avocado monster for the third and final time, and played the scavenger hunt, where we had to swim around flooded Faron woods, and collect these tadpole music note things. This is one thing that I couldn't help but notice about Skyward Sword, the amount of reused areas. You have to retrace so many of the same 3 main areas of Faron Woods, Elden Volcano, and Lanu Desert over and over again, with the slight spin put on it, but it just felt like I was doing the same thing repetitively. Like, you have to traverse the same area of Faron Woods 4 times, once with hunting down the Kikwis, once with the Faron Woods Silent Realm, once with revisiting the Skyview Temple to find the sacred water for the Dragon Lady, and once for hunting down the musical notes. And that's not counting all the times you have to visit the sacred grounds to fight the imprisoned. Doing all of this may not seem as bad during a casual playthrough, but in playing this game as fast as possible during this challenge, the repetition here just felt like I was in a perpetual endless state of playing Zelda, as if my existence revolved around playing these games. So long story short, I was done for the night, but then I started to think. I was pretty close to being finished with Skyward Sword. All I really had was a couple of smaller missions in Elden Volcano, in Lanu, one more dungeon, and then the final boss fight. And then I had 2 Zelda games left, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Despite these games being absolutely massive, with tons of side missions and lots to explore, if players are determined enough, they can try taking on the final boss fight upon leaving the Great Plateau in Great Sky Island for the first time. Beating the dungeons, completing the shrines, and collecting upgrades in these 2 games certainly makes the final stand a lot easier, but doing all this extra stuff isn't required in the slightest. That's when I set a new goal for myself. Can I complete this challenge in 6 days instead of 7? If I had any hope of beating these last 3 games in one more day, I needed to wrap up Skyward Sword as quickly as possible, without any deaths or any major delays of not knowing where to go next. I was able to blast through the Elden Volcano and Lanu Desert side missions without trouble. In Elden Volcano, you have to traverse the map in a pretty easy stealth mission of finding your stolen gear. And in Lanu, you're basically in an auto-scroller, where you have to follow around this time shift stone on a track. The Lanu one was a bit harder, because of course these electric dudes had to be there, but I didn't die or anything, which was nice. From here, I made my way back to Skyloft where there was one more Silent Realm, as well as one more dungeon before the final boss fight. I've heard a lot of people say that the fourth and final Silent Realm in Skyloft is the hardest out of all of them, but I didn't have much trouble with most of it. I'm pretty familiar with the map, running around Skyloft for hours on end when I played this game as a kid, and the map is pretty small, which allowed for the sacred tiers to be pretty close together. I did tragically save the hardest and scariest sacred tier for the very last, which was unfortunate. I definitely should have saved that one for the beginning, but it worked out fine in the end, so I exited the Silent Realm, which only took me like 8 minutes to complete, which was significantly faster than the previous two. The final dungeon of the game was up next, and it was actually pretty tricky. It's very open-ended and non-linear, where you have to move rooms around in order to track down all pieces of the Triforce, and it all gave me war flashbacks of that puzzle in the Cabana in Wind Waker that I definitely did not need to play. I was able to knock out the dungeon and begin the final stand with a showdown against Girahim. The lead up to the final fight was kind of annoying, whereas you're running down the sealed grounds. You have to kill at least 100 bokoblins and moblins who chuck bombs and arrows at you. Also, there's these super annoying blue bokoblins that are part ninja apparently, and can move faster than Link himself. Even the fight against Girahim was pretty tough this time around, especially when you have to fight him on the grounds. He ate through a lot of my health before I killed him, where I only had 1 heart left going into the final fight against Demise. And well, I definitely was not about to take him out with 1 heart left, but I did have a fairy, so let's see where this goes. And I died. Definitely not what I was hoping for. I really wanted to put this game in the past, because it felt like I was playing Skyward Sword forever at this point, so I stocked up on full health and entered the final fight against Demise for the second time. I was able to make it to phase 2 of the fight while losing half of my health, which really wasn't a good sign, because Demise does twice as much damage in the second phase compared to the first, so I really needed to buckle down, focus, and try my hardest here. He does 2 hearts every time his sword makes contact with you in this phase, so I could only be allowed to get hit by him twice. But I did have a spare fairy in my back pocket with the 1 bottle I picked up. So now I had 6 hearts left to spare against the hardest boss in the game. Wow. Just wow. With 1 heart left to spare in a dream, I managed to take down Demise and put Skyward Sword in the books. Thank goodness that lightning shock damage that I took only did 1 heart of damage, instead of the usual 2 hearts of damage you take when Demise hits you with his sword, or else I think I would have actually lost it. But my arduous journey only really begins at this point. I have 2 of the hardest Zelda games ever left to beat, both to beat in less than a day, with me being very fatigued from playing non-stop Zelda for the past 5+ days. What makes these last two games so challenging for me is that they're essentially a boss gauntlet that I'll be attempting with very bad gear and barely any health. So, let's jump right into the most brutal section of this challenge by a mile.
Open your eyes. Wake up, Link.
Continuing the challenge with Breath of the Wild, I was immediately aware of how much harder of a game this was compared to all the previous 3D Zelda entries. In the previous 5 games, I was pretty used to being pretty careless with my health, especially in the starting areas, which are pretty baby-proof. But in Breath of the Wild, it is super easy to die right upon leaving the Shrine of Resurrection. And yes, I died more in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom by a long shot compared to the previous 5 Zelda games. Partly because I was so unused to their engine from not playing them in so long, but also because I was very tired at this point. I did have a large advantage coming into playing these 2 Switch exclusive Zelda games, however, and that takes the form of watching speedruns for these games and being pretty familiar with where to get the best items and gear right away and the best routes to take to get to the final boss. So right upon exiting the Shrine of Resurrection, I picked up some Hylian shrooms to increase my health as a safety strat, and picked up some bladed rhino beetles to use for brewing mighty elixirs that I'll use during the boss gauntlet at the end of the game. I also went ahead and picked up this woodcutter's axe, and you probably already know a violation of the challenge rules that I set for myself. I said I wouldn't perform any glitches, but you can clearly see me whistle sprinting. During my playthrough, I totally forgot this was even a glitch, because it's so easy to do, and quite frankly, considering that Nintendo left it in the game for so long, I feel like it's an intended feature at this point. So sue me. Even though I used this glitch a lot in this game, it didn't really give me all that much of an advantage, where it only really let me get from place to place slightly faster than normal, and using that glitch in Breath of the Wild was my only instance of performing a glitch in this challenge. So don't you worry. So from here, I bonked a bokoblin with my axe, stole his shield, activated a Sheikah Tower, and ran my way over to the bomb shrine. This shrine went without incidents, and I went ahead and knocked out the Magnesis shrine as well, without any trouble. These shrines are basically tutorial sections, so they're really nothing worth dwelling on. From here, I warped to the Shrine of Resurrection, grabbed some more Hylian shrooms for safety, and began my trek towards the Cryonis shrine. It was probably just me being careless and being so used to Skyward Sword's relatively easy combat, but I actually died quite a bit in the snow area. Like, a lot, actually. Just cue the death montage. I kept blundering trying to get up to the Cryonis shrine, but even after I knocked out the shrine, I kept freezing to death in the tundra trying to find the stasis shrine, which wasn't my best performance by any means. And if I was dying like this in the Great Plateau, I didn't even want to think about how the final fight would go. Once I finally made it to the stasis shrine, I knocked it out easily enough, and then I tried to quick travel to the Temple of Time, where you put a bomb under this rock and use stasis to... Not exactly what I was intending. I went ahead and jumped off a cliff to reset my hearts, which bent my elbow into a less than ideal orientation, and made my way up to the Temple of Time the old-fashioned way, to get the paraglider from King Graham Bosphorus Hyrule. I then warped to the Omen Au Shrine, jumped off the Great Plateau to tame a horse, and died from blunt force trauma. That's nice. So after trying again, I showed the horses who the dominant species was, and began my trek to Hyrule Castle. On my way, I picked up a hearty radish as a safety strat, because once cooked at a cooking pot, it gives you additional yellow hearts, allowing you to take at least an extra hit of damage before dying, because almost everything during the Ganon boss gauntlet will one-shot you with Link having 3 hearts. One additional rule that I'll set for myself, for my playthrough of this game, is that I won't be using any amiibo as a crutch. For those that don't know, if you scan amiibo in this game, that spawns a chest from the heavens along with various items that can help you. I decided to not use amiibo because quite frankly, I barely even own any, and it just seems like a cheap way to get gear, and I'm certain I could knock out this challenge anyway without the amiibo handicap. Once at Ganon's castle, I made my rounds to collect as many good weapons as possible, where I found 5 bomb arrows in a chest, picked up a knight's bow, a knight's shield, a knight's broadsword, 3 ancient arrows which are extremely useful against Ganon, as you'll soon see, and I took out this black Lizalfo for his monster parts, shield, and boomerang. Conveniently enough, there was actually a cooking pot right here, so I cooked up my big hearty radish, and also whipped up 2 mighty elixirs, which take 2 bladed rhino beetles and 2 monster parts to make one. From here, I bombed the wall to get 3 more ancient arrows, knocked out 2 black Lizalfos and 1 black Moblin to get their weapons and shields, and there were also a lot of goodies laying around this room that I took full advantage of. I then climbed up some stairs, showed a Lionel who's boss with my ancient arrows in exchange for 10 bomb arrows, took out another black Moblin to get his weapon and the Royal Guard bow, climbed up Princess Zelda's study, and paraglided over to the entrance of the final boss gauntlet. This is easily the hardest part of Breath of the Wild during this challenge run for me. For those that don't know, in a normal playthrough of this game, if you clear each of the 4 Divine Beast dungeons, when you enter Ganon's Sanctum, the power of the Divine Beast will weaken Ganon and make your fight against him easier. However, I didn't have that privilege. I had to beat each of the 4 Blight Ganon bosses in a row, with 2 phases each, and then I had to take down Calamity Ganon who has a full health bar, not drained by the power of the Divine Beasts. Also, what's worse is that if I died during any of these guys, I'll be sent straight back to the very first Blight Ganon. Even dying during the Calamity Ganon boss fight will send you all the way back to the first Blight Ganon. So, let's get right into it. The first variant of Ganon I had to fight was Wind Blight Ganon, which was a bit annoying, but not crazy difficult. After he does his laser attack, you can run right up to him, drink your mighty elixir, and knock him down with a one-handed attack. He does do this thing where sometimes he's a bit too high in the air for you to reach him, which is super annoying, but the more you run around and dodge his lasers, he'll eventually get a little lower. So once he's stunned, you can spin around with a 2-handed weapon and do major damage. Just keep repeating this, and you're on to phase 2. Phase 2 is pretty unpredictable at times, so I played it pretty safe most of my attempts and shot him down with an ancient arrow right away, which is a way to stun all the Blight Ganons instantaneously, and spun around with a 2-handed weapon to do damage. In this phase, I also experimented with shooting him with bomb arrows while he was in the air to slowly chip away his health, but he would oftentimes teleport away a bunch, so more often than not, I would just use 2 ancient arrows on him to get through this phase quickly. Next up, there was Water Blight Ganon, who was probably the easiest out of the 4. His first phase is super easy, where all you have to do is circle around him, and when he attacks, you can just spin to win with a 2-handed weapon. And if you do it right, you can situate yourself between his body and his hand to do double the amount of damage than normal. Phase 2 of this guy wasn't much harder, where he teleports to the ceiling, but if you shoot him 2 times in the face, he falls down and you can spin to win to do major damage on him. Rinse and repeat, and you're on to Fire Blight Ganon. Fire Blight Ganon was definitely the second hardest Blight to defeat, mostly because he was super hard to try and stun. I kept dying trying to spin to win him, until I eventually just said, whatever, and resorted to bombing him in the face over and over again, which slowly chipped down his health. This wasted arrows that I should have probably saved for the Calamity Ganon fight, but I died enough to this guy that I wasn't afraid of just using them up now. After a bit of bombs to the face, phase 2 came in no time, which was honestly a little bit easier than phase 1. He starts off with this fire sucking attack, where if you place a bomb down, you can detonate it and send him to the grounds, allowing you to spin to win for a bit. After a bit of hacking him down on foot and cleverly placed bomb arrows, he was down in no time. Now we have the hardest Blight by quite a large margin, Thunder Blight Ganon, who I probably ended up dying the most to, which was super frustrating because he's so late into the boss gauntlet. The first phase was the less brutal of the two, where in order to deal damage, you have to backflip at just the right time to do a flurry rush with your weapon, until he's half health and you can move on to phase 2. The timing to flurry rush is consistent each time he attacks, but I hadn't fought this guy in like 5 years, and each time I wanted to even attempt this guy to learn his attack patterns, I had to beat 3 other Blight Ganons in a row, which was just so time consuming. The beginning of phase 2 is pretty simple, where you can just stand in a corner and use Magnesis to shock him with one of his metallic pillars. Things quickly became a free-for-all though, where he electrifies his sword and shield, and it's so easy to get electrocuted. It took me quite a few attempts to master this technique, but if you're close enough to him, you can throw your weapon at his shield, break it, pick back up your weapon, shoot him in the face with an arrow to stun him, and spin to win to chip away his health. From here, you can keep shooting him with ancient arrows before he regenerates his shield, and spin to win until you win. I know I just talked through each of these 4 boss fights like I'm an expert at them or something, and can take them down no sweat, but it actually took me a lot of repetitions to figure out what works best for me to take down these bosses. And that's why I think it'll be fun to have you enjoy an offbeat drill death compilation. So sit back and enjoy the montage. As you can see, I died, and I died a lot. But after a little over 2 hours of deaths upon deaths, I finally took out Thunder Blight Ganon for the first time and made my way to the true final boss, Calamity Ganon. Calamity Ganon's attacks are very similar to the 4 Blight Ganons, where he's essentially a grotesque monstrosity of all of them combined, but Calamity Ganon does have significantly more health compared to all of them, which makes this fight harder than the Blights. In Phase 1, you have more options to deal damage to him, where you could honestly just keep spamming bomb arrows and ancient arrows at him until he enters Phase 2. Being that I didn't spend much time collecting resources in this run, I had limited arrows, so I had to resort to perfect dodging his attacks and shield parrying his lasers to stun him so that I could spin attack him. In Phase 2, shooting him with arrows won't work because he'll summon a force field, so only flurry rushing with perfect dodging and shield parrying his lasers will work in that phase. In this phase is where things get really intense, because with one missed laser parry, out of the dozens I'll have to perform in a row, I'm done for, and have to start the Blight Ganon fights all over again. So let's jump right into it, shall we? And well, I unceremoniously died with a laser beam to the face, because I didn't realize that I had my sword out and not my shield. Being that it took me so long to even attempt the fight against Calamity Ganon, I knew something had to change. I knew I needed to leave Hyrule Castle and stock up on some better equipment to even have a chance at beating the game in this state. Now we're talking. Loaded up on mighty elixirs, fairies, good weapons, and the almighty power of the mighty Durian, I entered Ganon's chamber. From spending so much time learning how to fight the 4 Blight Ganons, with worse gear, they were almost a cakewalk now, where the 3 times attack boost mighty elixir this time around helped the fights go a lot quicker, while preserving durability on my weapons. Also, the extra ancient arrows and bomb arrows that I picked up allowed me to use them during the Blight Ganon fights, without being too worried about wasting them before getting to Calamity Ganon. So before I knew it, I entered the true boss fight for the second time, except this time, I was prepared. and with one final shield parry and spin to win, I defeated Calamity Ganon once and for all. Stocking up on fairies and durians was absolutely essential for me to beat Calamity, and I'm super glad I took time to stock up on extra items. If I kept trying to brute force my way through, with the same gear I had my first go-arounds, I would certainly still be struggling even trying to get to the Calamity Ganon fight, let alone winning it. Now all that was left was a glorified cutscene against Dark Beast Ganon, where we had to shoot at him with the Bow of Light on a horse. Also, what's best with this fight is that if you die during it, you restart at the beginning of the fight and don't have to refight Calamity Ganon or any of the Blight Ganons, which is super nice. I'm not sure in what world someone would actually die to this thing, because it's honestly super easy, but I was feeling nice about that little safety net for me, in case I royally messed up. I did get stomped on by one of Ganon's hooves though, but only took half a heart of damage, which is absolutely absurd, because that's more damage than the horse did, who headbutted me seconds upon leaving the Great Plateau. Also, when Beast Ganon did that, I'm pretty sure he stomped my horse to oblivion, because even when I whistled for it, it didn't even come to me, so I had to take on the rest of the fight on foot, which was no big deal. So upon riding the updraft with my paraglider, I shot Ganon in its big old ugly eye with my bow, and beat Breath of the Wild. It felt really good to be done with that game, and it felt nice to have a bit of time to have a breather before the next challenging section I'll have to face in this run. I honestly didn't think I would spend so much time at Breath of the Wild though, where I didn't expect spending a whole 2 hours dying over and over again during the Blight Ganon fights, and I didn't think I'd have to spend a bunch of extra time riding across Hyrule Field, hunting down attack and health upgrades to help with the final fight. On this 6th day of the challenge, I had been playing for close to 8 hours, which was getting close to the 12 to 13 hours I've been spending playing games during the first 5 days of the challenge, so I was having my doubts if I'd be able to beat Tears of the Kingdom that same day. You'll soon come to realize this, but Tears of the Kingdom also has a boss gauntlet similar to Breath of the Wild if you try to take on the final boss fight upon leaving the starting area right away. However, the gauntlet in Tears of the Kingdom is significantly more challenging and longer, so I was fully expecting it to take longer than Breath of the Wild, at the very least. Also, what's worse, is that the further into the night it gets, the more tired I'll be, which would cause me to make more and more simple blunders, which I could not afford at a time like this. So, with as much confidence as I could muster, I booted up Tears of the Kingdom to try and put this challenge in the books. The beginning of Tears of the Kingdom started out very similar to Breath of the Wild, where instead of beating tutorial shrines and learning runes in the Great Plateau, you beat tutorial shrines and learn runes on the Great Sky Island. Also, I'll preface by saying that in addition to not allowing myself to use Amiibo in Breath of the Wild, I won't be using Amiibo in Tears of the Kingdom for the same not wanting a handicap reasons, and I won't be using any glitches in this run, so no duplication glitch, or zuggling, to skip the entire boss rush, or anything like that. The Great Sky Island part of this run went pretty average, with nothing out of the ordinary, so I won't bore you with the specifics there. I knocked out all the rune shrines to get all the runes, and made sure to stock up on as many bomb flowers as I could find, to use during the boss gauntlet. I also went ahead and scrounged up as many miscellaneous food items as I could find for safety reasons, but I didn't necessarily go out of my way to stock up on food or anything. Upon opening the Temple of Time doors, I plunged to the surface below. In the top speedrun any % records for this game, players don't bother getting the paraglider because it's actually not even required to beat Tears of the Kingdom, and getting it is a somewhat time-consuming process, traveling back and forth from Hyrule Castle to Lookout Landing. I will be, in fact, getting the paraglider, because I don't want to take any chances so late into the run, and not getting the paraglider would require Link to have multiple dangerous falls that end up with scraping his fingertips on jagged rocks that I thought it would just be worth it to pick it up. Also, the Colgera fight seems like an absolute nightmare without it. Once I got the paraglider, I learned from my mistakes playing Breath of the Wild, and made sure to go out of my way to pick up some safety items before plunging into the depths below Hyrule Castle to take on Ganondorf and his army. Firstly, I warped back to the Great Sky Island, and took a wing all the way over to another Sky Island, where 4 fairies reside that I made sure to snag. I then warped back to the Great Sky Island, and took a long wing trip all the way over to the Faerun region to search for materials to make 3 attack up Mighty Elixir potions, where each one requires 3 Mighty Bananas, 1 bladed Rhino Beetle, and 1 monster part. There's this little ranch in the forest with these bull dinosaur looking things that's full of bladed rhino beetles on the trees and bananas all over the place, which I made sure to take full advantage of and brewed up a total of 5 mighty elixirs. I also found these Hylian tomato plants all over the place that I made sure to collect for safety to eat for health. Out of all the things sorely missed in this game though, that's present in Breath of the Wild, that would be the hardy durian that I used for those extra yellow bonus hearts. I guess the devs thought that these things were so overpowered in their debut game, which they were absolutely broken, that they decided to not include them in Tears of the Kingdom, so I had to go without those extra hearts during my run of this game. So satisfied with my collecting of goodies, I warped back to Lookout Landing and began my trek towards the final stand. Once at Hyrule Castle, I climbed a wall along the outer walls and opened up a gate with Ultra Hand to find a secret passage with some hidden weapons and materials. In here, I found a diamond and killed a blue Lizalfo and a black moblin for the materials to fuse on my weapons, found some food items in crates, and found a knight's halberd in a chest. These knight's weapons were super useful in my run because they have an attribute called Desperate Strength, which multiplies their damage output by 2 while Link is on 1 heart or less. Nobody in their right mind would let Link be chilling on 1 heart during a normal playthrough, but since I only have 4 hearts anyway, and will likely be killed in 1 shot by most attacks, my plan was to keep my health at 1 heart or less during the entire boss rush. I know, I'm an absolute madman, but the combined health of all the bosses I'll have to face is astronomical, so I really needed to preserve the durability of my weapons with the limited number of weapon slots I had. So once my inventory was all in order, I ascended to the surface and began the plunge into the depths. Now this is where the actual challenge of the run begins. In the path leading up to the final fight arena, there's a bunch of enemies standing in your way, but most of them Link can just run past because they are not required to beat. They do have very powerful fused materials, gear, and weapons though, so in my case, I needed to defeat a lot of them in order to have enough equipment to stand a chance in the final fight. I started off paragliding down below some likes in a cave with some monkey enemies. I then ran past them into the next room with some electric keys, who I killed for their eyeballs and electric wings that will be crucial for fused material later in the run. I then fused one of their wings to a sword of mine, returned to the monkey room, and shocked each of the monkeys to force them to drop their weapons so that I could steal them for my use later on. I didn't actually kill any though, because they've been good to me throughout the past few days, and also because I just didn't want to waste any of my weapon durability on them. I then entered the next room where I encountered my first big obstacle, the Lynel. I used some fire food to get myself down to 1 heart to get that juicy double damage with Knight's weapons, and started the fight. I did have 4 fairies that would bring me to full health if I got hit by the Lynel, but I really wanted to save those for the final gauntlet, so I needed to beat this enemy without getting hit, where I would reload a save to warp back to the beginning of the fight whenever I ended up using a fairy on accident. After quite a few resets, lots of flurry rushes with my 62 attack damage diamond spear, I managed to take him out to earn some very useful loot. I took a shield, triple shot bow, and a couple of very high damage fused materials. I went ahead and fused the white maned Lynel saber horn to my knight's halberd to get a 100 damage weapon while at 1 heart, which is absolutely insane for a weapon of such high attack speed as a halberd. And after a cleverly positioned ascent through some gloom, I made my way further into the depths. The next couple of rooms were pretty scary, but weren't too bad because I could just reload a save if I took any damage. I took out some ice keys for their useful fused materials, found the knight's shield in a chest, took out a couple of Lizalfos with my overpowered knight's halberd, picked up a royal bow, and fused a silver Lizalfo's horn onto a royal broadsword for yet another high damage weapon that I'll be keeping in my back pocket until later. I also went ahead and killed some choo-choos for their jelly that will be necessary for the fight against Muktarok a little later on, snuck around a Gloomhaven like the stealthy ninja Link is, and blew up some rocks for 10 bomb flowers to use for arrows later on. And in the last little stretch, I ran past some few remaining enemies, killed some Gibdos and took their bones for fusing onto my arrows for later on, blew up a few remaining rocks, and came upon the precipice before the most brutal section of the run that these past 6 days have been leading up to. The final fight against the Demon King's army, and the duel against the Demon King himself. For those that don't know, the final fight in this game is very similar to Breath of the Wild's, where the more dungeons and bosses you beat throughout Hyrule, the less you will have to fight again leading up to the stand against Ganondorf. Being that I essentially strolled up to Ganondorf's doorstep right after setting foot off of the Great Sky Island, I had to defeat 4 waves of enemies, and then complete 6 boss fights with 2 phases each, before I even got a chance to fight Ganondorf. Also, if I die at all during the gauntlet leading up to Ganondorf, I had to start the entire thing over again, so this is truly a test of endurance. I do get 4 fairies as somewhat of a cushion, but I haven't beaten a single one of these bosses before because I barely completed the Great Sky Island in my casual playthrough, so I was pretty nervous going into this. And worst of all, I'll be trying to beat all these enemies with less than a heart remaining to get that knight's weapon attack boost. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First up, we have the Demon King's army. More specifically, the fight against the Bokoblin Horde. Right upon starting the fight, I immediately shield jumped onto a bomb flower and rained down fire from above with my triple shot Lynel bow with ruby and bomb flower fused arrows. This took out a large majority of them, which was super helpful because it's super easy to take damage from these guys when a bunch of them gang up on you and start attacking you at once. Also, I was pretty grateful that I had to fight all these enemies before the 6 bosses, and not after, because beating these underlings actually caused me the most trouble because they were so unpredictable, and I couldn't tell you how many times a random Boku threw a rock, and it caused me to use one of my fairies. Also, this big guy gave me a lot of trouble because he takes up so much weapon durability to kill, so eventually, I just resorted to freezing him and pushing him off the arena to kill him that way. Even freezing him was a bit of a challenge though, because somehow he knew exactly when I was about to throw something at him, so he juked me the last second, causing me to waste my ice materials, and more importantly, waste the limited amount of time I had left in the day. So whenever I messed up against the Bokos and used a fairy or something, I would reload a save because I really needed those fairies for later. The second horde was against the Lizalfos, which were not as annoying as the Bokoblins, because there weren't as many of them, but they kept hopping around, which made them hard to shoot, and they kept using their spit attack from a long range to hit me. In most of my attempts, I ended up taking them out the same way as the Bokoblins, where I would shield jump to slow down time and rain triple shot bomb arrows onto their heads from above. I also really didn't want to waste any of my fairies with these guys, so most of the time when I got hit in this phase, I would just reset my attempt. The next horde against the Gibdos was the easiest out of all of them, where I don't think I died a single time against these guys. You can kill each of them with one shot with a fire arrow royal bow combo, and their slow and predictable movements made them an easy target. The Moblin horde, also the last horde, was probably the second easiest, where my long-ranged 100 attack halberd made them pretty easy to pick off from a distance, along with my 3 attack up mighty elixirs. Unlike the Bokoblins and Lizalfos, there's no archers you have to worry about with this one, but I did end up getting hit a few times in this phase, mostly because I was just being careless. I did make sure to pick up one of their Knight's Claymores and fuse my white maned Lionel Macehorn on it though, which does a whopping 102 attack damage when Link is on 1 heart, and I made sure to use this weapon heavily when I got to the actual boss fights. So once taking out the last Moblin, I moved on to the first of 6 bosses, Colgera. I'd say Colgera was the easiest out of the 6, especially since I went out of my way to obtain the paraglider. The triple shot Lionel bow with key size fused onto the arrows made it so that I could destroy each of its weak points with 1 shot. I honestly don't think I ever got hit while fighting this guy in my run, where if anything, I just learned how to fight him quicker and quicker the more reps I got on him, after dying to the later bosses over and over again. Marbled Goma was the next boss, where my 102 attack damage Knight's Claymore was there to shine. In the first phase, you can just recall his stone bomb thing back to him, ascend up to his eye, and spin to win to send him to the second phase all in one go. The second phase actually gave me quite a bit of trouble, and I died a decent amount of times here, because I didn't realize that you had to stand really far away from him for him to spawn the rock bombs that you use Ultra Hand on to bomb his leg. Marbled Goma was so large and the arena was so small compared to him, so I just kept running around his feet not knowing how to reveal his weak point, until I just ended up getting stomped to death. Eventually though, I became comfortable with his patterns, and he turned into one of the easiest boss fights in the boss rush. Next up, things don't get crazy harder, compliments to my Lionel fused Knight's Claymore, yet again, where we fight Muktarok. In a regular playthrough, in the Water Temple, most players take this guy out with Sidon's ranged water attack to make the boss vulnerable so that you can attack it. Of course, I didn't spend time even talking to Sidon in this playthrough, so with a couple of Choo Choo Jelly fused onto my arrows, you can make Muktarok vulnerable to your attacks. After a couple of spin to wins in phase 1 and 2, I was able to beat the boss just fine, without very many deaths. Next up, we have Queen Gibdo, who is arguably the most scariest boss of all of them, and I died quite a few times to this one, which was super demoralizing so late into the run. After a bit of attempts, I was able to develop a pretty solid methodology for beating her. You need some sort of lightning attack to deal any damage, so starting off, I fused an electric keys eyeball onto my triple shot arrows to knock her on the ground, and then shot her with the Gibdo Bone triple shot arrow to stun her. From here, I just spun to win with my Knight's Claymore to quickly get her into phase 2. Phase 2 is a bit more challenging because she spawns a bunch of underlings to get in your way, but they move pretty slow, which was helpful. I damaged her in this phase pretty similar to the previous phase, where with 2 Keys eyeball shots, she falls down, and with a Gibdo Bone arrow shot, she gets stunned. I then did a bomb jump to slow down time, and shot her in the head with Gibdo Bones until she died, because I didn't want to risk getting hit by a rogue Gibdo if I tried spinning to win again. I know I just talked through that fight like it was super easy, but it took me quite a bit of attempts to master, where if you're too slow with your execution, Queen Gibdo can totally destroy you with one of her attacks. And one of her Gibdo underlings can catch up to you and smack you so easily. But long story short, I was ecstatic when I was able to defeat her for the first time. After this phase, you take on the second to last boss before Ganondorf, Seized Construct. This one seems like it should be one of the easiest, but in most of my attempts I made it close to the end. This is the fight where I ended up using the most of my fairies, due to getting hit. The amount of time spent beating enemies leading up to this guy is so long, I never really had time to develop a foolproof way to beat this guy, and mostly just winged it. Most of my attempts just revolved around me walking up to him and trying to smack him into the electric fence, hoping that he wouldn't hit me before I hit him, causing me to die. So after some miracle Hail Mary of a run, where I didn't die to this guy, I made it to Phantom Ganon for the first time, the last boss before a save checkpoint, with 0 fairies left, and this is how it played out. I barely stood a fighting chance against Phantom Ganon, not even making it to the second phase, where I was unceremoniously slayed by a mere ghost of the real enemy of Hyrule. What I really struggled with in this fight was the timing to dodge Phantom Ganon's attacks. I never faced this enemy up until this point, so I wasn't used to the flurry rush timing, which is almost a necessity to master if you want to beat this guy without getting hit. The amount of time I had to spend on the other enemies and bosses before I even got an attempt at this guy again was super long, so I knew I had my work cut out for me. There was one silver lining in my first attempt against Phantom Ganon though. Upon getting hit by him over and over again, I realized that he cannot one-shot you like many of the other bosses. If you get hit by him with 4 hearts remaining, you get brought down to 1/4 of a heart, and I spent a decent amount of time cooking and collecting food that I could use to heal myself over and over again, while hunting for resources earlier on. If I knew it would come down to this, I would have collected and cooked a lot more food, but this gave me hope that if I could make it to Phantom Ganon and outlast him with my food I have stocked up, maybe I would have a chance. So from here, with the revitalized and determined spirit, I continue the grind with the end of the challenge in sight. After a lot of focus and efforts, I made my way into the Phantom Ganon fight for the second time. Except this time, I made it to phase 2. And well, I choked. With a Gloom Club to the noggin, I went from a full 4 hearts to 0 in an instance. This second phase was no joke, and I knew I could not just rely on my food stash to power through it. I needed to get good. Before I knew it, I made it back into the second phase Phantom Ganon fight without any food, 1 fairy left, almost full health, and a heck of an amount of bombs. this is how it played out. And I did it! The most vicious section of the run was complete, but it was not over yet. I had to face the Demon King himself, Ganondorf, and he was no pushover. If I wanted to defeat him, I'd have to get very good and consistent at perfect dodging, which was a major shortcoming of mine during the Phantom Ganon fight. Luckily, whenever I died in this fight, I respawned directly outside of the final Ganondorf fight, and I took this to my full advantage because I died a lot at Ganondorf. There was a lot of trial and error going on of me learning his attacks and how to dodge them, but with each attempt, I got further and further until eventually, tragedy struck. Remember how I said I would purposely keep my health low at 1 heart for a majority of the boss rush to get a double attack on the knight's weapons? Well, whenever I died to Ganondorf, I would use the gloom before the final boss room to whittle my way down to 1 heart before facing him again. Most of the time this worked out fine, but in one instance, well, just see for yourself. I accidentally used my last fairy taking damage to the gloom. At first when I did this, I thought, oh, when I die to Ganondorf again, I get this fairy back, right? Well no, I was wrong. The checkpoint to respawn just outside of the Ganondorf fight only kicks in if you die during the final fight, so if I accidentally touched the gloom for too long, died, and didn't have a fairy, that would mean I would have to fight all 4 wards again, along with all 6 boss fights. I was super happy that I had a leftover fairy to help teach me this, because if I didn't have a fairy at that moment in time, I would have certainly died there, thinking I would respawn right before Ganondorf, when that would have not been the case whatsoever. Also, what makes it even crazier is that when I was collecting fairies before coming to the final boss rush, I kept collecting 3, but the 4th one kept despawning for whatever reason, so I was close to just collecting 3, thinking that it was impossible to collect 4, but I kept reloading a save and trying over and over again to collect 4, until I finally did, thinking that it probably wouldn't have mattered in the ends, but it certainly did. If I didn't spend a bit of extra time to collect all 4 of those fairies, I would probably have been back fighting the goblins at that point. So after almost having a heart attack, I went back into the duel against Ganondorf with 0 food items, 0 fairies, and well, just see for yourself.
Is that all?
I managed to kill Ganondorf, all while maintaining a single heart or less of health, instead of relying on the gloom before entering the boss fight to bring me down to 1 heart, because I wasn't about to risk that again. I realized that the very first attack that Ganondorf does during the fight, he always brings down to 1/4 of a heart, which I made sure to take advantage of. Also, I found it pretty convenient that I used my last elixir potion to increase my attack damage right at the tail end of the Ganondorf fight, where I ended up making use of every little food item and fairy to get through this gauntlet. The challenge isn't over yet though, despite me having played Zelda for about 16 hours in this one day. I still had to take on the demon dragon, and at this point, I wasn't stressing at all. Similar to Breath of the Wild's Dark Beast Ganon fight, this is another glorified cutscene, albeit a little bit more challenging in Tears of the Kingdom. Also, if I managed to die during this one, I would just respawn at the beginning of the dragon fight, and not have to take on Ganondorf again. So after retrieving the Master Sword embedded in the Light Dragon's skull, I chopped off Demon Dragon's warts, stabbed it in the head until it blew up all of Hyrule and its inhabitants like a literal hydrogen bomb, and caught Princess Zelda in the afterlife to put an end to this game, and put an end to this 6-day-long challenge. One that started with young Link frolicking in the woods as a child, and ending with adult Link chilling next to Zelda in the grass, and well, in his underpants. Wow. Just wow. This was heck of a challenge, and I'm so glad I was able to complete it and have it behind me now. For those of you that are curious about the numbers, and how long I spent on each game, up on the screen I put the statistics of how much time I spent playing games in each of the 6 days, as well as how much time I spent in each of the 7 games. The time spent gaming on each day started when I first sat down to play for the day, and ended when I called it quits for the day. So I didn't subtract any time eating food or taking small breaks. As you can see, I spent right around 81 hours playing 3D Zelda over the past 6 days, and it certainly felt like that long. I started out pretty full of energy early on into the challenge, in the first couple days, but as time drew on and on, I became more irritable, especially towards the end of each day, where I just wanted to rest my eyes and go to sleep. I think the only reason why I was able to put a little over 16 hours into the final day was because of the adrenaline, and me knowing that I was so close to being done. Also, the brutal difficulty of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom really got me engaged in the task at hand, where longer, slower games like Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword kind of felt like I was just in a never-ending fever dream of 3D Zelda. But luckily, I managed to push through in the end. Also, little fun fact, I beat the first 6 games before this challenge, but this was actually my first time beating Tears of the Kingdom. And what a way to go out. Thanks to all of you who stuck around to watch the whole video to join me on this journey, and comment Deku Nuts if you watched until the end of the video. I'm curious to see who the real fans are. This video marks the most time I've spent on a single video by quite a large margin, so it might be a while until I do something like this again, unless this video really blows up. So I'll set a goal. If this video gets 50,000 likes, I'll do a video like this again, but with beating all the 2D Zelda games. And if this video gets an astronomical 250,000 likes, I'll 100% all the 3D Zelda games in a video, like this with a time limit. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this video. Make sure to subscribe to not miss out on future videos, and I hope to see you in the next one. I'm going to get some rest.